Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Jumped and Kacchan Never Left His Side? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. This was disorientation. Jarringly, he feels what seem like hands pulling and tugging at his body, forcing him onto unsteady legs, wrenching him away from the boy he was clinging to. Red and blue flashing lights left him in a dizzying haze. Every sound was altogether deafening and muffled at once. Voices, sirens, the sound of screaming. Whose was that anyway? Why did his throat feel so raw? Was this what drowning felt like? That tight, constricting feeling in your chest, stealing the breath from you. The rush of your own heartbeat in your ears, the muffled din rushing loudly, surging through your head, pulsating in nauseating waves. His equilibrium was off. He could hear a cacophony of questions being directed at him, but Katsuki was drowning in a sea of red. The sight of Icarus' descent would forever be burned into his retinas. An image akin to melted wax. The harsh breaths that make it past his lips are nothing short of choked, pained gasps, and he finds himself fighting against the hold of the EMTs attempting to restrain him, his trembling hands reaching out, desperately searching. Everything was so wrong. He was late. He was too late and everything was red. He hardly remembers anything that happens next, each second a passing blur. Only reacting when two more EMTs run past him with a stretcher, he tries again to force his way closer. Yet still he was restrained. Couldn't these people understand? They were seriously pissing him off. Couldn't they see? He had to be near him. He had to know if he was okay. He had to know if his shoddy attempt at CPR even worked. He'd never been this stricken in his life. As if the axis of his world was flipped entirely upside down. And yet, what else could he have expected? The signs had been there. However, like everyone else around them, he'd elected to ignore them. Blindsided by a sunny disposition and ceaseless optimism. It was Deku after all. Cheery to a fault. When did all of that slip away? How did it ever get so bad? Panic spikes within him as they move Deku's broken body, leaving nothing but a smear as a reminder on the pavement in front of their school's main entrance. A thought occurred to him then. It had to have been the beginning of the week. Deku had seemingly been himself up until the beginning of this week. However, Katsuki was so preoccupied with his own trivial matters, boasting about UA or getting himself into trouble, that he hadn't noticed the shift. Just when had the fight left those Viridian eyes? In the end, it didn't matter when. His light was snuffed out and he was too late. Too painfully late to realize. Izuku's flame had been extinguished. And now, the pavement, his prone body, everything was coated in angry, brilliant, flaming vermilion, and this was one fire that Katsuki couldn't put out. He'd fed up. After everything? He'd practically written the script. Guilt left him trembling as paramedics diligently worked on the broken boy beside him in the ambulance. They raced against time. To get to the hospital. Vaguely, he realized shock was setting in. His body had moved on its own. He didn't even remember hearing himself beg to come with them. He didn't even know why they let him. He could hardly be considered any type of family to Deku. He'd lost that right long ago. He'd never get it back. Anxiety grips him tightly as the paramedics charge up their defibrillators. Katsuki watched, agonizingly, as his once childhood friend flatlined twice on the way to the hospital. Never before has a heartbeat been so infuriatingly fickle, like the flicker of a candle in the dark on a windy night. The odds stacked against them. It stunned him to realize that he'd have given anything for just a few moments longer. As if somehow he could reach out and physically keep Izuku's heart beating with sheer willpower alone. Thankfully, for once, time was on their side as they pulled up to the ambulance loading bay of Mizudafu Regional Hospital. Everything that happened after that was a blur, but apparently it hadn't passed without some more fight on his part. Young man. Katsuki is startled from his rage when a pair of fingers snap together in front of his face. His dazed gaze locks onto that of an elderly woman, a medical assistant it would seem. I understand that this is an awful and traumatic experience for you, dear, But there are some important questions that we have to ask you and we can't do that unless you calm down. Can you do that for me? Katsuki's mouth clamps shut in shame, nodding mutely. Okay, good, she continues gently. Now, we need to know the young man's name. Izuku, Midoriya Izuku, Katsuki rasps out, vaguely taking note that he'd been provided with a blanket. And how are you related to Midoriya? She asks next. That he's in my class. I see. Her expression is tight and questioning as she enters the information he was providing onto a tablet. Would you happen to know anything more about him? Who his parents might be? Or any emergency contacts we should be aware of? The realization dawns on him like a slap to the face. Oh God, his voice cracks. Auntie Inko. Dread rushes through him at the thought of how devastated she was going to be. Guilt grips him like a vice as unknowing tears stream down his cheeks. The medical assistant hesitates but asks him a few more generalized questions before giving him some space. What seemed like hours trickle by. During this time, Katsuki was moved into a private waiting room just outside of the OR. Several different people, medical staff and policemen included, come to question him and take his statement during this time. Having rasped out answers on autopilot, they assure him that his parents have been contacted. An officer by the name of Tsukachi Naomasa appears later and stays with him, sitting just to his right. Whether out of respect for his space or due to Katsuki's own surly nature, the older man elects to maintain silence, not bothering him with any more unnecessary questions. Unless the need arose. A ways off, familiar voices could be heard and Tsukachi stands abruptly. Excusing himself, he walks down the hall before disappearing from sight. Shortly thereafter, Katsuki's parents both round the corner. A gasp and pained sob could be heard in their wake. Katsuki had never heard such a raw and painful sound in his life. It dawned on him instantly and he knew. His parents had brought Auntie with them. He was caught in a haze of tight embraces, worried expressions, hushed reassurances, and several more prying questions. At this point he was so drained, he could hardly find it in himself to answer them. And even still, despite everything that has happened thus far, nothing could have prepared him for the sight of Aunt Inko being led down the corridor moments later. Her crumpled face was distraught and tear-stricken, a wad of tissues clenched tightly in her hand. Katsuki knew he must have been a distressing sight, when upon seeing his blood-stained uniform and hands, Inko was nearly brought to her knees, if not for Tsukachi steadying her. Several more hours passed and it was a waiting game in which time was of the essence. The next few hours were a mixture of dozing in and out of a fitful sleep, coffee and smoke breaks, barely audible conversations, nail-biting and pacing. There was hardly a word from the surgeons and the hallway's occupants hardly knew what to make of it. It was nearing 1 in the morning. School had let out that day at 3 and Katsuki stayed in detention for about an hour, making it about 4 o'clock by the time he walked out of the main entrance before seeing. He shudders despite himself. How long had Deku been up there? What kind of thoughts were running through his head? Katsuki tried to keep himself in the present as he chewed his bottom lip. His parents stand, each of them giving Auntie a tight hug and a few whispered words. The pair of them make their way over and give him a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder and a kiss to his hair, as they walk out for yet another coffee and smoke break. It was then that Katsuki found himself alone with Auntie Inko. At this point, it had been almost 9 hours since Izuku was admitted for surgery. Although her expression was mostly dismally blank, Katsuki found himself bristling under the older woman's inspection. She stared at his bloodied hands for an age before uttering, "You should really get yourself washed up, dear. It's not good to let Bill dash," she cuts herself off, "to let it dry on you like that." Katsuki hesitantly glances down at his stained hands and nods numbly. Standing to his feet, he's about to make his way to the restroom before her voice halts him again. Her voice is quiet, almost as raspy as his own. "I'm glad," she says after a moment. Katsuki's tired crimson gaze meets her own puffy eyes so like his, it made Katsuki's chest clench. "He wasn't alone," she continues. "Had you not been there, then," she trails off, "they wouldn't be here, clinging desperately to some semblance of hope." It went unsaid, But Katsuki knew that if he hadn't had detention that day, they would be having a completely different conversation. One that certainly involved funeral arrangements. "It's funny, you know," she huffs humorlessly, her lips trembling slightly. "I never once suspected that something like this would happen. I never even entertained the thought. Let alone realized how much pain he'd had to have been in." Her breath hitches. For him to see no other way out, to do this? How could I not see it? I should have seen it. She wrenches back a sob, finding her voice again. Does that make me a terrible mother? As Katsuki finds her watery gaze again, he treads closer, his heart in his throat as he crouches before her, taking her tightly clenched fists into his hands. His gaze is downcast, staring at their hands, at the contrast of the blood flaking off of his stained fingers. "This isn't your fault, Auntie." He gulps harshly, a familiar sting clouding his vision. His own watery gaze meets hers and he can see recognition in her eyes. If I had been there for him, if things were like they used to be, if I weren't such an a-hole, maybe he wouldn't have jumped, is left unsaid, but still he powers on. His spark, he lost it because of me. And I can never. He could never forgive himself. It was his fault. He'd planted the idea like a seed he'd never known would grow. Deku was always stronger than he appeared. Katsuki had had no cause to believe that he'd taken his awful jeering to heart. Inko's lips were pursed tight as she stared down at the boy crumpling at her feet. She could see the deeply seated guilt growing within him. Guilt not much unlike her own. She gives his hands a tight squeeze. Sure, she could be angry. She could place blame, but at the end of the day, this was on her too. If she'd believed in him more, or maybe if she hadn't been so fearful of his dreams, so overprotective. She knew something was up with Izuku when he'd come home one evening last week and hadn't touched a bite of his katsudon. Inko had just assumed he was tired, or that he wasn't feeling well. She'd had no idea it could have been this, that her little boy would. "None of that now," she replies with a strength that blinds Katsuki. He couldn't fathom how she'd even summoned it. "I guess that just means we've got more work to do." Katsuki's own resolve steals at that and he gives her a nod. That was the understatement of the year. If Izuku survived this, Katsuki would undoubtedly spend the rest of his life making up for his mistakes. There were no two ways about it. After cleaning himself up, a few more hours pass in which their respective parents end up huddled and cuddled restlessly in the waiting room chairs. His parents giving Inko as much needed support as they could offer. Katsuki, as usual, elected for space, which they gratefully gave him. Each of them startles as the double doors of the OR finally swing open, revealing a very haggard-looking surgeon and to Katsuki's immense surprise, a pro-hero. Recovery girl. Inko is on her feet in an instant, clenching a tissue tightly in her hand. After 12 hours of waiting, they were all on pins and needles. None of them speak for a moment. After massaging the bridge of his nose, the surgeon speaks up, eyeing every one of them solemnly. "I want you to know he is alive." Inko sobs into her hands in relief and Katsuki's mother comes up from behind her and brings her into her arms, steadying her. Katsuki, on the other hand, wasn't as relieved. He knew a lingering, but when he heard one, his fists and jaw clench in anticipation. This surgery wasn't an easy one. And as you can see, he gestures to the smaller woman beside him, we'd even had to enlist the help of Recovery Girl here. Thankfully, she was on staff here tonight. We couldn't have done this at all without her help. The elderly hero smiles tightly, giving them a nod. Your boy's injuries were very grave, I'm afraid. And to be frank, it's a miracle he even survived. We lost him several times but, graciously, he's a bit of a fighter, that one, Recovery Girl relays. Katsuki feels strong hands grip his shoulders and it was only then that he'd realized he was trembling. He gratefully accepts the grounding contact. That being said, the surgeon continues after Recovery Girl had said her piece, he isn't out of the woods yet. Not to be the bearer of bad news, but this could quickly take a turn for the worse in a number of ways. I want you all to know the reality of what we are faced with here, full disclosure. Recovery Girl interjects, the wounds Izuku received were extensive, some of which require more medical jargon to explain than one would care to hear at 4 in the morning, she adds, trying to lighten the mood a bit, but before long, the serious edge comes back to her voice. Not including his broken back, arms and leg as well as any internal bleeding he had, Izuku has sustained considerable head trauma, the severity of which is as of yet to be determined. This is obviously our main focus and concern, she finishes with a frown. With the help of Recovery Girl, we managed to stop the internal bleeding completely, as well as mend most of his broken bones, shortening his recovery time in what we'd estimate to be about half. In due time and with an extensive amount of physical therapy, we are confident that Izuku could make a full recovery. We currently have no cause for concern that he wouldn't be able to walk again, the surgeon informs them. However, Recovery Girl adds, as it is with all head trauma, it is highly unpredictable and could very well affect him in many different ways. As is, he is still in critical condition. He had extensive swelling as well as a brain bleed that we managed to address, but he will likely need more MRIs and/or CT scans to even see the full extent of the damage, and the unfortunate reality is that there is only so much that my quirk can do without causing his body more harm than good. For now, we have him in a medically induced coma, although at this point the likelihood of him waking up on his own is slim. We did this as a precautionary measure to keep him from inadvertently exacerbating his injuries until we can get a full read on the situation at hand. What he needs now is rest and rehabilitation. Once his body has, for the most part, regained some of its stamina, we may be able to try the use of Recovery Girl's quirk again. I understand. A coma seems like it would certainly be necessary at this point. Auntie Inko reasons, more with herself than them it would seem. Mrs. Midoriya, we don't want to alarm you, but given the severity of his injuries, we want you to be prepared for any eventuality. Katsuki's heart sinks as a rage bubbles up his throat to replace it. His fists clench tightly, his anger directed at no one but himself. It was irrational, he knew, but anger was by default his go-to emotion more often than not. All of this was just so unfair. Sure, Deku survived, but now what? Does he stay in a coma? For how long? What was the likelihood that he would even wake up? What if he did wake up and he was a FNG vegetable? What if he did wake up and he no longer had any of his cognitive functions? What about nerve damage? Brain bleeds? Amnesia? Cerebral edema? Blindness? Paralysis? He could be FN deaf now for all they knew. At what cost was his life spared? It almost felt selfish. There was no way he was just going to walk away from something like this as if it never happened. And on top of that, the psychological damage would be just as severe. Sure, say he didn't remember any of this, that'd be great and all, but he'd still thrown himself from a 4-story building. Something like that raised questions. Something like that left scars in places that couldn't be seen. Katsuki pulls away from his father's warm hold and storms off down the hall. The older man attempts to call out to him, only to be stopped by his mother. She knew more than most how he worked. She was a hothead herself most of the time. Katsuki appreciated that she respected his need for space. Stepping out into the cool autumn night, he could barely feel the chill. His emotions were wound so tightly that he hardly knew what to do with himself. His palms were gripped so tight, they were smoking. It wasn't often that his natural control over his quirk slipped. It felt like he was trapped on a roller coaster hanging upside down. As he paced back and forth under the starlit night, he catches sight of a tall, wiry, and very lithe blonde man, who looked like a stray wind could blow him over. His expression is somber as he walks toward the hospital's emergency room entrance. They make eye contact and his gaunt face pinches in what seems like concern, but Katsuki promptly avoids his gaze, continuing to pace. His problems were of no concern to the skinny BSRD, and he sure as shit didn't need pity. He needed much more than pity. He needed a miracle. At times like these, Yagi Tashinori usually had at least a few words of hope or encouragement. No matter how dire a situation was, there was always a silver lining. After all, he was a hero. The hero. He was a pillar in the community and a global symbol for peace, and yet, at that moment, he couldn't come up with a single thing to say. What could a person say at a time like this? Congratulations, you're not dead? Or, sorry for crushing your spirit? Guilt was a dreadful thing, as was shame, and at the beginning of this week, he'd thought he'd felt the worst of it. He was very wrong. You see, he was in a bit of a jam when one Monday morning he was low on stamina. Villain after villain came out of the woodwork, and all he'd been trying to do was run an errand. Alas, crime waits for no one, and especially not for their groceries. He was All Might after all, the symbol of peace. He had a job to do, and do it he must. He was on his way to the general store that morning when he'd come across a wanted criminal attacking a young boy. He'd had just enough time left to make short work of the fiend and be on his way, but that wasn't entirely how things played out. The boy in question was a timid, meek, and anxious middle schooler with forest green hair and equally vivid green eyes. He was chock full of youthful optimism despite his recent encounter with near death. That honestly should have been Toshinori's first red flag. The boy had more questions than Toshinori had time to answer them, and as much as he'd regret sliding a fan, he really had to go. Time was of the essence, and if he didn't book it soon, his secret would be exposed. The green-haired boy had other plans, however. Toshinori really did not bank on the kid being such a wild card. The kid had managed to get the drop on him and clung to him for dear life as Toshinori leapt high into the air. After quite the startling turn of events, Toshinori attempted yet again to get away from the kid as soon as possible. He'd had about 5 minutes or less left, and he simply could not afford to dawdle any longer. The kid began to express to him about how much he'd wanted to be a hero, just like him. He explained how he wanted to smile in the face of adversity and bring hope to others. At any other time, Toshinori would find this endearing, inspiring even. The young man went on to relay that he'd been quirkless since birth, and oblivious to Toshinori's current plight, he'd asked him if it were possible for a quirkless boy like him to become a hero. As soon as his answer flew out of his mouth, he'd immediately regretted it. He'd answered the boy in a fit of self-absorbed panic, and he knew it. And soon enough, his panic was all for naught. To his credit, even with his incredulous reaction, the kid did seem honest enough. So Toshinori leveled with him. He went on to tell him things he'd mentioned aloud to only a select few. He'd even told him of his unknown injury and the time limit that had restricted the use of his quirk. He'd then gone on to tell the boy that he could not become a hero and that helping people in other ways was just as respectable. He'd told him to be realistic in regards to his limitations. At the time he'd simply felt ashamed. And as he walked away from the kid, he'd felt guilty. As he wandered the rest of the way to the police station to deposit the encapsulated criminal, he honestly just felt like shit. How could he say that to such a seemingly bright kid? A quirkless one at that. What kind of hero crushed a child's dreams and told them to settle for less than what they were aspiring to be? There were plenty of pros who had passive quirks and relied on regular human strength alone. A good friend of his just so happened to be one of those. How could he have just walked away from him like that, knowing full well that he himself had been a quirkless child? In that moment he realized he would come to regret those words for the rest of his life. At the time, he just hadn't factored in how much. He talked about his fears and regrets later that evening with the one person he knew would listen, his best friend Tsukachi Naomasa. The man did his best to assuage his worries, but they both knew this was something that would stick with Toshinori for a long time, not to mention it was a serious liability issue. After ruminating over it, both men came to the conclusion that the kid wouldn't say anything. It didn't seem to fit his character. He'd no doubt had a sense of justice and a great amount of respect for All Might. The odds of him talking about what had transpired were low. Both men had decided to table the situation for a later date, should the need arise. It was 4 days later when he'd gotten the call. A young boy, a middle schooler from Aldra Junior High, matching the description of the kid that Toshinori had encountered 4 days previous, had thrown himself from the roof of the school. Young Midoriya Izuku, only 14 years of age, quirkless and often the target of relentless physical and emotional bullying, had attempted to take his own life. As Naomasa solemnly relayed this information to him, Toshinori felt as if the wind had been knocked out of him, and reflexively he found himself clutching his injured abdomen. With all of the power that One for All granted him, for all he was as the symbol of peace, he'd felt utterly stripped and powerless. Naomasa tried his best to placate him, informing him that the boy had survived the fall, but there was no consoling the hero as he withered in self-hatred. Surviving something like that almost seemed just as cruel as succumbing to his injuries would have been. There was simply no fixing this. Not in a typical sense. And now the poor kid was in surgery, fighting for a life he'd legitimately felt had no merit. Tears streamed down Toshinori's face as he hung up with Tsukachi, who had to take care of the young man that had found Izuku, a boy named Bakugo Katsuki, who had apparently been present when Midoriya jumped. Not knowing what else to do, he found himself calling the only other person who knew him best, seeking advice for circumstances that were so far out of his depth, they were an ocean, in which he was adrift. It was one of the hardest conversations he'd ever had with Gran Torino, who oftentimes was like a father to him. It left him feeling raw and exposed. And the older man had only one piece of advice to impart to him. Make this right. As he made his way to Mizudafu Regional Hospital, Toshinori only wished that he could. After some insistence from the nursing staff, Katsuki was made to shower and promptly given a pair of white scrubs to use in place of his school uniform, which had honestly seen better days. During this time Izuku was subjected to a few more tests before they were finally allowed to see him. Katsuki knew it was going to be bad. Hell, he'd seen the kid at his worst, but he was still unprepared for the sight they were all met with. Fresh tears flooded from Auntie's eyes with a renewed vigor as she rushed to her bedridden son. The sight they were met with was an uncomfortable one. A tangled mess of wires and tubes and fluids surrounded Izuku's slight form. His body was a mesh of bandages, coagulated scrapes, and visible yellowing bruises, which was the really astonishing part. It was jarring to see just how well Recovery Girl's quirk had worked to repair such extensive damage. Deku had been black and blue and red all over. His body had been twisted in ways that only seemed possible in those American Looney Tunes cartoons they'd watched as kids. At the time Katsuki was scared to even touch him, let alone perform CPR, out of fear of hurting the boy even more, but now, it seemed more like he'd been in a bad car wreck a week ago and not like he'd been dropped off a building the day prior. It was truly amazing how well he looked now compared to mere hours ago. And maybe it was because only Katsuki and the doctors really knew the extent of just how bad his injuries were, but Katsuki felt hope bloom throughout himself. Maybe Deku really did have a chance at making a full recovery? By the time 8 a.m. rolled around, the older Bakugas found themselves sleeping in shifts while Inko and Katsuki remained vigilant at Izuku's side. Between the pair of them, their eyes bloodshot and bodies sore, Katsuki was sure that they were only still awake out of unyielding determination alone. The private room they were situated in was mostly devoid of any sounds but that of the heart rate, or EKG, monitor and various life-sustaining machines respectively. As Inko was beginning to nod off in her bedside chair, Katsuki couldn't take his eyes off of Deku's still form. His curls were a tangled mess and his hair was shaved down to his scalp in some places. His face was covered in scrapes and some minor lacerations. All things considered, actually looked relatively good. There were no obvious outward deformities to be worried about, just a few superficial things that shouldn't leave any major scarring. Seeing the subtle rise and fall of his chest set Katsuki's singing nerves at ease. Before long, he could no longer hold open his weary eyelids, and he too was asleep, his head pillowed snugly next to Izuku's thigh. Katsuki awoke next to the vivid smell of coffee and a light shake of his shoulder. As tired crimson eyes blinked into awareness, he was greeted with the sight of his father's soft smile. Katsuki groans as he sits up, a stiffness in his shoulders likely being the cause. Blinking around the room, he noticed it was devoid of his and Deku's mothers. Where? He rasps out, his throat very dry. He rubs the sleep from his sore eyes and yawns deeply. I managed to bully them into getting some sleep, his father kids. I used the, "Is this what Izuku would want?" card and they begrudgingly complied. They are holed up at an inn down the road, neither of them wanted to go home. His father relays, gingerly waving the coffee cup in front of Katsuki's face. He accepts it gratefully. His father really was the best. In a way, Izuku reminded him of him. They were both well-mannered and soft-spoken, both were patient in ways that Katsuki couldn't begin to fathom, the both of them were pretty nerdy too. Taking a deep pull from the spout of the lid, Katsuki hums in appreciation. What time's it? He mumbles, still too tired to form coherent sentences. Just after 3:30 in the afternoon, the older Bakuga replies, taking the seat on the opposite side of Izuku that Auntie had occupied earlier. I dropped them off at around 2 p.m. and went home for a change of clothes for everyone. The coffee was kind of an afterthought, he explains. Katsuki nods faintly, as though spaced out. He takes another drink to wake himself up. I figured I would leave you here, seeing as I didn't think you'd leave him even if I asked. His father relays knowingly, a light-hearted edge to his voice. Katsuki grumbles into his coffee, feeling his face heat up despite himself. I also took the liberty of letting the school know you'd be out for a couple of days. They completely understood, although, incidentally, they actually let me know that they'd canceled classes for the following week and that your absence wouldn't reflect on your attendance. I'm guessing they are having to deal with liability backlash issues. Apparently, the school's roof access was supposed to have remained locked at all times. He trails off, taking a sip of his own coffee. Katsuki nods a handful of times to himself belatedly. Thank you, he eventually replies. Despite the caffeine doing its job, he still felt completely drained. He could tell that his father had wanted to ask him a whole slew of questions, but he refrained. Katsuki didn't know if he was grateful for that or not. You said you brought me clothes? The younger Bakugu. Course. Yeah, they're right on the table behind you, his father gestures. Leaving Deku in his father's capable hands, he grabbed his clothes and went to change. Maybe if he got himself more cleaned up he wouldn't feel nearly as shitty. He had his doubts, but one could hope. The next shift change reinvigorated Katsuki's ever-ready fight response, as one nurse had the ball enough to tell him that visiting hours were over. As one could imagine, this did not go over well. He was so irate, in fact, that Izuku's primary care physician was called in after hours to talk him down. Or rather, Katsuki liked to believe that he'd actually been called in to tell the third shift staff to promptly F off, but whatever. In the end, he'd been given the same special permission to stay after hours as Auntie Inko, and that was all he cared about. Around 10 o'clock that evening, Auntie walked into Deku's room, still looking haggard, but far more rested than she did when he last saw her. Bakugu Katsuki, she starts with an edge to her voice. Oh? The fine hairs on the back of his neck prickle. Why did I receive a phone call from the receptionist saying that you told a nurse to, and I quote, stuff a bedpan up her butt and leave you the F alone? She chided him. To his credit, he tried not to laugh, but it really was too funny to hear Izuku's mom cuss. It was like finding a unicorn in the wild. They tried to make me leave. What did you expect me to say? Inko's gaze softens marginally and she nods in understanding. She'd thought about it before, and it was way more apparent as the days went on, but she had a feeling that she and Katsuki were going to be seeing a lot of each other more often. It almost made her nostalgic to think about it. Both of her little boys in the same room again. It was sad that it had to be because of something like this. She'd really wished they could have resolved their differences before all of this, without life or death stakes being involved. More often than not, she wondered what drove such a wedge between two boys that were practically adjoined by their diapers. She wondered if she would ever find out. All she wanted more than anything was to see both of them interact again, in a healthy manner. It would make Izuku so happy. She reaches out and pinches Katsuki's ear, almost laughing at his unsuspecting hiss, but she remains firm and unyielding. I expect you to apologize in the morning for causing them so much trouble, mister. They were just doing their job, and part of that job is ensuring that their patients have enough rest. Am I understood? Katsuki visibly blanches and nods as she releases him. Yes, ma'am, he agrees quickly. As he rubs the soreness from his ear, Auntie takes her seat on the other side of Izuku's bed. He wonders if this was why Deku was so DMN proper all the time. Geez. She's scary. Have you eaten? She asks a few minutes later. Katsuki takes a moment to consider this, and apparently it was a moment too long for his auntie's taste because she was already standing to her feet and walking to the door. Her fingers grip the threshold as she lingers, craning her head back toward him. What would you like to eat? Katsuki gives her a shrug. I honestly haven't had an appetite. The last thing I had was the coffee Dad brought me around 3. She hums in acknowledgement. I'll bring you back something light then. Watch over him for me? Katsuki stills. It was as if that validation alone was all he needed. Auntie Inko trusted him. She trusted him with Izuku's well-being, and he'd be dead if he ever screwed that up again. Never again. Katsuki gives her a nod and a silent vow, and before he knew it, she was gone. His eyes trail back over to Izuku's intubated form, frowning slightly. All was quiet aside from the machinery at work. Discreetly, he reaches out and takes his hand, being mindful of the IV connected to it. "You have one hell of a mother, Deku," he murmurs. "Hurry up and get better, so you don't keep her waiting, 'kay?" Just out of Katsuki's line of sight, a lithe figure lingers near the doorway, watching the boys briefly with solemn blue eyes. Contrary to Katsuki's opinion, unfortunately, school was apparently still a thing, and his parents, Auntie Inko, and even the goddamn hospital staff all insisted he go back. They told him that getting back into his normal routine would do him some good. It was honestly ridiculous how outnumbered he was. If dropping out and becoming a vagrant who lived off of the land was more appealing than going back to that Hell's Cape, who were they to judge him? Life goals were life goals. Although, in reality, Katsuki didn't know what to make of returning to school, but he did know that the thought of it made him ill. The entire train ride there, Katsuki kept trying to think of ways to talk himself out of going, to just turn around and ride the next train back to the hospital, but he didn't have a choice. His mother would likely drag him back by his ear, harping at him the whole way. He'd rather not deal with that. Soon enough he'd reached his stop and walked the rest of the way to his destination. His hands trembled as he stepped into the school's courtyard. With the intention of avoiding as many people as possible, he'd purposely arrived 10 minutes late. The fewer eyes there were on him, the better his nerves would be. Making his way down the sidewalk, his chest begins to tighten, his quickening pulse thrumming like a war drum. He stops dead in his tracks, realizing that what he'd been feeling was dread. He could tell that they'd scrubbed and scrubbed, but still, Katsuki could see it. The faintest outline of blood. Deku's point of impact. He stared at that spot for an undetermined amount of time, as if he could will it away. As if by doing so he wouldn't hear the distant echo of Izuku's bones shattering or the rattled cough that came from deep in his chest as he began to choke on his own. Katsuki jumps, shaken from his thoughts by the vice principal as she laid a hand on his shoulder. He couldn't make out any words, he didn't quite care what she'd said anyway. It was probably something along the lines of "you're late," or "the bell rang 15 minutes ago." However, as he met her eyes, he could see that her expression was one of pinched concern. Of course, they all probably knew. "What?" he croaks out lamely. "Bakugo, dear, can you tell me what you need? Would you like to go sit? Should I call Dash?" "No," he interjects hurriedly, pulling away from her. "I'm fine. I just need to get to class. Sorry I'm late." She attempts to reach out, only to pull her hand back and let him go. Shaking off that uncomfortable encounter, Katsuki braced himself for the next one. He could tell that this would only get worse as the day went on. Sometimes he hated being right. As he opened the door to his classroom, their teacher immediately stopped talking mid-lecture. All eyes were on him and he could feel them roaming his body. Akin to centipedes, their gazes were invasive and sent discomforting chills up his spine, leaving pinpricks all over his arms. He tried to ignore it, but failed. "The F you losers looking at? Take a fucking picture." Despite his harsh words, his tone was quiet, subdued. It sounded foreign even to his ears. As he sat down in a sea of superficial stares, he'd never felt more alone. Looking to his right, he couldn't take his eyes off of the vacant seat across from his. It only seemed to serve as a reminder of where he'd rather be. If first PRD was uncomfortable, second PRD was hell. By third PRD, his skin itched every time someone stared at him and whispered under their breath. By lunch, the rumor mill was in full swing. Whispered words, stares, jeers, giggles, suspicious or pitying glances. As all of these swirled around him like some twisted vortex, he'd wondered, not for the first time that day, if this was just a brief glimpse of what Izuku felt like on a daily basis. The thought left him feeling sick to his stomach as he went through the lunch line. Everyone acted as though he couldn't hear them, that or they knew he could and just didn't care. The rumors spread like a plague as he heard awful things like how he and Deku got into a fight on the roof and he fell as a result. Or that he'd pushed Deku off the roof to see if he'd had a flight quirk. Or that Deku decided to off himself because he'd realized how weak a quirkless nobody like him was. Or worse yet, that Deku actually died on the way to the hospital because the EMS didn't see the point in saving him. Katsuki tried to keep his cool, he really did, but the perpetual anger that always simmered below his skin rolled to a boil. He took a deep breath and promptly exploded. Inko knew something was wrong when Katsuki stomped his way into Izuku's room at 1:15 in the afternoon. His rigid posture and the puffiness of his eyes told her all she needed to know. Giving Izuku's hand a gentle squeeze, she stands, crossing the room until she approaches the boy in the threshold. "I'm parched," she starts casually, not yet questioning why he was there. "Come with me to get some coffee." It was phrased as a question, but said like an order, and Katsuki was honestly too drained to attempt to deny her. The pair of them informed the nursing staff that they were leaving for a while and exit the building. The walk to the coffee shop wasn't too long, but it was long enough for them to expend a fair amount of energy. Inko knew they'd both needed it. They've been cooped up in the hospital for almost 2 weeks now. This was good for both of them, or at least she kept telling herself that whenever her mind wandered into unsafe territory. "Aren't you going to ask?" Katsuki fishes. Inko shakes her head. "I didn't want to pry, but I didn't expect you to be the first one to break the ice either," she replies. With a sigh, Katsuki stares down at their feet. He was almost a whole foot taller than her, but they were keeping a pretty even pace. "Well, there's no point in delaying the inevitable. F it up today." It was a testament of how used to Katsuki she had grown when she didn't even react to his potty mouth. "In what way?" The boy at least had the decency to seem abashed. "Blew up in the school cafeteria today, both figuratively and literally. I'm sure it won't be long until Mom finds out. So I'm harboring a fugitive, then?" She teases. There was no point in being mad. She kind of suspected this would happen, although she had hoped school would have been more of a positive distraction. They gravely miscalculated on that one. Katsuki, to his credit, did seem remorseful, but Inko just knew there was a righteous indignation hiding underneath. From the time he could walk, Katsuki, in his own weird way, never did anything without there being a reason behind it. He, like her Izuku, was a very bright child. Very analytical and precise, as well as alarmingly perceptive. If he blew up the school cafeteria, there had to have been an underlying reason as to why. "I will talk to your mom," she decides, watching as surprise colors the teenager's face. "But, in return you have to tell me what happened, deal?" "Deal," the perplexed boy replies, with the slightest bit of hesitation. They reach the cafe and order their respective drinks, and when Katsuki attempts to pay for his own, Inko smacks his hand away, with a smile. "My treat," she says simply, and she watches as any argument he'd had dissolves on his tongue. They tuck themselves into a corner booth and settle in, enjoying the small stretch of silence in which they sip their drinks. "Okay, kiddo, what happened at school today?" Inko asks after a moment longer. Katsuki's expression darkens as he fidgets with the plastic rim of his cup. She'd seen this same expression on him 2 weeks ago. This didn't bode well. She steeled herself for whatever he had to say, and she was glad she did, because what he tells her next is both surprising and unsurprising all at once. "Just a bunch of assholes who didn't know shit about what the F they were talking about," he grumbles. "They were talking about Deku, as if they knew anything about him. Judging him without knowing the situation. It was cruel and it set me off." Inko nods, her expression dismal as she peered into her coffee cup. "I was afraid that might have been the case." Katsuki fidgets. "I didn't want to go back," he confides. "I don't want to go back either. I'm not ready." When I got to the school's entrance where it happened, I spaced out. I don't know how long I was standing there, staring at the ground, before the vice principal came and shook me out of it. Katsuki begins to bounce his leg nervously. His expression was painfully grim, like the light had been eaten out of his once expressive eyes. Inko finds herself frowning. This whole ordeal had changed him drastically. "I was there," he whispers. This draws her attention back to his eyes. "I saw it happen," he confirms, an obvious tremor to his voice. I was FING around as usual and landed myself in detention. When school let out, Deku, Izuku hurried out of class. I assumed he'd gone home. I had no reason to believe he didn't. The kid was a magnet for trouble, so it made sense that he'd book it out of there as quickly as possible. I didn't think for a minute that it was. Inko sits in silence, listening with rapt attention, so Katsuki continues. I didn't have time to react. There was no time to call out to him. There was no way to prevent it. In that moment, I completely seized up. All I could do was watch, and in seconds he'd hit the pavement, the boy recounts miserably. Inko's heart felt like it plummeted into her stomach. Her eyes began to water despite herself. It was like time ceased to exist at that moment. Like nothing else mattered but making it to his side. Seeing if he was alive, fearing that he wasn't. Because who could survive that? The stress in his voice spoke volumes. He'd kept this in the entire time. He'd hid all this pain under a carefully constructed mask. Sure, she'd seen him cry at times. She'd seen how he interacted with Izuku over the last 2 weeks. Those longing looks, forlorn glances. The small touches he thought she didn't know about. That puzzling guilt. But she hadn't realized the extent of all that he was keeping to himself. It was the single most horrible moment of my life. He attempts to clear his throat with his coffee, and I'm completely to blame for it. Honey, Inko slides her hand across the table and lays it across Katsuki's, who pulls away reflexively as though burned. His eyes were wide and glistening. He looked like a wild animal, scared and cornered. No, Auntie, you don't get it. This isn't just some guilty conscience bullshit talking. This isn't me talking out of my butt, wishing sheet could be effing different. It's the honest-to-God, literal truth. If you knew, his voice takes on an almost hysterical edge. If you really knew what I was like to him. The sheet that I said or did to him that day. Or the day before that, and every other day before that one and that one, you would know. His face crumples. You would know what a complete piece of shit I really am, and how much I don't deserve your kindness. You'd know how FING toxic dash. Katsuki, she tries, please, don't say things like that dash. I told him to do it. He all but sobs, his voice cracking as the unshed tears finally stream down his face. Inko is stunned. What do you mean, you told him? His head hangs low, avoiding her gaze. It's my fault that he jumped, because I was terrible to him, what I said was cruel, but I swear if I thought for a minute he'd actually do it. Katsuki, what did you say to him? Her voice sounded terse even to her own ears. He straightens himself out. Squaring his shoulders, despite his red-rimmed eyes, he looked at her dead on. Staring at her like a man about to face his final moments. A man staring down a firing squad. A week before the incident, in class, we were talking about the hero courses at our respective high schools of choice. He was talking about joining U.A again. Talking about joining the hero course. I don't know why, but it set me off. I threatened him, told him I'd kick his butt if he joined you. He had no business getting himself into something he couldn't handle, or at least that's what I thought. Looking back, I know I was dead wrong about all of it. I think in my own way I was worried. But it's no excuse, I had talked out of my butt again. Inko glares down at her coffee cup. Her hands were so tight around it that her knuckles were white. She had a feeling she knew where this was going. I told him out of spite or fear or worry, I don't know. His voice got gradually softer as he went on. It never should have even come out of my mouth to begin with, but it did, and I can't change that. And if I could, in a heartbeat I would, hell if I could swap places. Her attention is piqued at that, her pulse quickening at that belated comment. She didn't think she could deal with another teenager hurting themselves. Not again. Thankfully, he just seemed to be commiserating. Acceptance seems to come over him, because the tension in his shoulders, his pinched expression, it all fades to a blankness that seems to overtake him. It was a look of such hopelessness that a teenager should never have to have. I told him, he says quietly, that if he was so dead set on having a quirk, that he'd probably have better luck in his next life, and to take a swan dive off the roof. All is silent, except for the typical background noise of the cafe. The pair of them are eerily quiet for a long time. neither of them having the will to look one another in the eyes. A flood of emotions came over her. She was angry. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to shout, cry, and shake him. But taking one look at him, she could immediately see that anything she did was nothing compared to how broken he already looked. He had the eyes of someone who lost more than just a childhood friend. But what he and Izuku had could hardly have been called a friendship anyway, so why? What right did this boy have to become so shattered by this? She couldn't wrap her head around it. This was more than your typical guilt. More than remorse. And god damn it, she wanted to hate him, but she knew in her heart of hearts that she couldn't. She was no better. She did nothing to encourage Izuku in his dreams. She more often than not told him he didn't need a quirk anyway. She even went out of her way to not use her own quirk around him. She didn't want him getting hurt. He was all she'd had. Hisashi was a prime example of what she didn't want to be as a parent. An unsupportive deadbeat. After he left them, she had given it her all to prove that they didn't need him anyway. That she would be enough for Izuku. She would keep him safe. Quirks weren't everything. If Hisashi didn't want a son without a quirk, so be it. It was his loss. She often tried to reinforce that he didn't need what he didn't have. Never once did she consider that this could be just as potentially harmful. She'd treated Izuku with kid gloves, even when he got older. And she'd always had this nagging feeling that she'd had a misstep somewhere with him. Like, maybe she'd said the wrong thing at the wrong time. Because after a while, Izuku stopped sharing his love for quirks with her. It came up often but not near as much. And he was always so private, scribbling or writing away in his notebooks. Taking notes on quirks. Notes that were detailed and fascinating when she'd gotten him to share them. They were truly impressive from an analytical perspective. She would often ask him what he was up to, but he'd shrug her off. Eventually this became normal. Like a teenager who had a diary, she thought nothing of it. His privacy was his right. She didn't question it. And that's where she failed. It was never just about quirks. It was about him helping people. She saw that now. He wanted to become a hero, no matter how. For all she knew, he could have wanted to be a doctor. He wanted to save lives, to make people feel safe. And she slighted him, thinking that it was an issue with quirks alone. She could be angry at Katsuki, but it was moot now, wasn't it? Like his mother, Inko's own best friend, he often said things he didn't mean. He was hot-headed, brusque, and sarcastic. He wasn't perfect by a long shot, but he wasn't a bad kid either. At the end of the day, like Izuku, he wanted to become a hero. He wanted to join UA. He wanted to be just like their shared idol, All Might. It must have been killing him to know that he couldn't save the one person he'd known his whole life. Even if they weren't on the best of terms. They were one another's universal constant. Could Inko really blame him for this? When she herself felt guilt? When she herself was also wrong? She didn't know. There wasn't a manual for this. It was said that the only way to deal with hell is by going through. That was all any of them could do now. The deeds were done. The question now was, where did they go from here? The truth, or Katsuki's truth, was out now. He was far from being Izuku's only bully. Inko was almost certain that this was a culmination built up over some time. He wouldn't have sought an out like this lightly, or from one thing that was set out of a million. Hell, that probably wasn't even the worst thing Katsuki said to him. That kid had no brain-to-mouth filter. She'd had to break up their petty squabbles a time or two. If Izuku was going to jump because of something Katsuki said, he'd have done it that day. He'd waited a week, according to the blonde, and for all his faults, he wasn't a liar by any means. Something more must have happened to break Izuku's spirit. Something he couldn't bounce back from. The question was, what? Auntie, Katsuki says quietly after a long tense silence. It was then that Inko had realized that she'd been thinking herself in circles again. Auntie, he says again as though conjuring up the courage, I am so sorry. If I had any indication that he'd take my words to heart, any at all. I wanted him to be safe. He was always going on and on about being a hero and he has zero self-preservation skills. I just didn't think. I didn't think about how much I was hurting him. I wish I could take it all back, but I can't. He was starting to ramble, she noticed. There are no excuses or reasons in the world that would make what I said acceptable, and I understand if you hate me, but I want to make this right. I know I have no right to ask you, but please, let me try, he urges earnestly. She's only seen him this determined a handful of times. Usually where becoming a hero was concerned. She scrutinizes every inch of him. His eyes, although sad, brimmed with a spark that just needed some kindling. Something settles inside of her. There was only one course of action to be had at a time like this. It's ultimately what Izuku would have wanted. I can't act as though you were the only one who has blame on their shoulders, she admits, making the teen tense in his seat. I think Izuku was affected by more than one circumstance. That being said, I don't know what to say to you. I can't say that I forgive you for what you've done, but I can't forgive myself for allowing this to go on either, she levels with him. Katsuki nods in understanding, his expression solemn. I am Izuku's only parent. I should have been more vigilant. I should have tried to understand him more rather than just trying to shelter him. He might be quirkless, but he's not helpless. A lot of this blame is on me too, and I can't begin to start forgiving myself yet. A stagnant silence settles between them. Katsuki's shoulders slump. I don't think it would be best to set our wrongs aside for now. We are both here now, and it's clear that you have done nothing but try to keep him safe ever since. The teenager perks up at that, eyeing her with an almost comical incredulity. That why you mean? She nods in confirmation. Let's work toward building ourselves back up so when the time comes for Izuku to wake, we can, in turn, build him up. He's going to need all of the support we can give him, nothing else matters than that. And once we've come to a place where we can rationally think about this, we can talk about forgiveness. I think that is the only fair way to deal with this. Katsuki nods in agreement. I can't act like you didn't help save his life. I can't forget that you have been at his bedside incessantly since the beginning, and I can't ignore that look on your face, because it's the same as mine. Izuku wouldn't want discord to settle between the people he cares for, so for his sake, let's put this behind us and move forward. Yes, of course. I'll do anything, Katsuki replies in earnest. Inko eyes him critically, her face one of stone-cold sternness. But, remember this Bakugu Katsuki, your mother might be my best friend and I may love you like you're one of my own, but if you ever hurt Izuku again, I will deal with you myself. You have my word, he acknowledges, his demeanor that of pure sincerity. Good, she gives his hand a pointed smack. Now finish your dimon coffee, we have somewhere to be. After a very pointed and enlightening conversation with his former teacher, Toshinori had a fair idea as to what he would do in terms of making things right. Were they a little unorthodox? Maybe. Were they borderline stalkerish? Certainly so. But before he went about throwing himself at the feet of Midoriya Izuku's mother and begging for forgiveness, he had work to do. He also had a few favors to call in. You see, Toshinori has always been a go-getter. He didn't believe in half-hearted efforts. He has always been driven when it came to certain points of interest. Some who knew him would even say that when he poured all of his energy into one single thing, he had a tendency to become borderline obsessive. He knew all too well how he fixated on things at times, but what some called unorthodox, he called efficiency. It was just how he worked. So, he knew it came as no surprise to his best friend when Toshinori called Naomasa in the middle of the night and asked for Midoriya Izuku's file. The ensuing conversation, however, tipped the scale between work-related ethics, such as confidentiality, and what constituted as privileged information. Basically, if Naomasa were discovered giving Toshinori a file on a 14-year-old's failed suicide attempt, some eyebrows would be raised. But if Detective Tsukachi were giving All Might said file, as means of helping with an ongoing investigation about the boys' school, no one would bat more than an eye. These were necessary loopholes that were often exploited between the two of them since forming their friendship back when Toshinori first became a pro-hero. Was it altogether legal purse? Probably not, but seeing as All Might worked closely with the police as a pro-hero, no one really counted that as such. Even so, Naomasa had his personal reservations. What are you doing, Toshinori? His friend asks, a tired edge to his voice. Toshinori fidgets as he holds his phone to his ear. Nothing nefarious, if that's what you're asking. Naomasa takes the joke for what it is by responding with a laugh. A long-suffering sigh escapes him next, making Toshinori twitch in anticipation. Look, I know you feel bad, but all of the kid needs are already being met. I talked with the school. They are taking steps to seal off the roof with a fence and padlock the access door. They are afraid of a legal battle ensuing with Ms. Midoriya. They have even provided help in making several students come forward as either being witnesses to the bullying or the bullies themselves. I've questioned them all, including Bakugo Katsuki, of whom Ms. Midoriya stated that she would not be pressing charges against. Toshinori frowns. But wasn't he the boy who found Midoriya? I thought they were friends? He's always in his room, watching him like some kind of guard dog. Naomasa shifts in what sounds like his bed. They are. However, there is a history there between the two, in which they weren't always on the best of terms. After speaking to him, his parents, and Ms. Midoriya directly, they had all agreed that legal action not be taken. The only thing being required of him now would be mandatory counseling and anger management classes, the subject of which is going to be brought up in person sometime within the next week. Toshinori stares blankly at his desk, nodding to himself. I see. That's good. After what the boy witnessed, I'm sure he feels just as terrible as I do. Toshi, Naomasa stresses, we've been over this. While yes, you did SCK at having tact dash. No, Naomasa, he interjects, I might not have been at any legal fault, and I know that I didn't push the kid off of that roof, but I also know that what I said was wrong. That poor boy was already dealing with so much on his plate. It doesn't matter that I might not be legally entangled. What matters is I failed as a person. Naomasa sighs. A moment of silence stretches between them, so Toshinori continues. I shouldn't have been so brash with him. I was a person that he looked up to and I let him down, during a time when he needed a hero. I should have been more supportive. Something like having a secret identity should never have come before helping someone in need. I may have saved the boy from a villain that day, but I failed to save him from himself. Naomasa groans, rubbing what sounded like his hand across his face. Look, if it truly makes you feel better, I will give you his file, but Toshi? Yes. Don't let this consume you. I know you have a soft heart and just how heavily it bleeds for people. Just don't let one off day in the life of All Might be one that makes you hang up the cape. Trust me, Toshinori responds, his voice determined. I have no intention of hanging up the cape just yet. I may be looking for a successor to One for All, but that doesn't mean that I will give up on helping others. All Might makes mistakes too, and he's got to make this one right. The file will be on your desk in the morning, Naomasa replies dutifully. Thank you, my friend, Toshinori replies, gratefully. Relief floods through him, alongside that determination. Nothing to it, I'm going back to bed now. Toshinori responds with a laugh, bidding him good night before hanging up. The next morning, when Toshinori wandered into the office he'd been given on the UA campus, he indeed found Midoriya's file on his desk. Other than the standard general information, he found as he leafed through the sparse 3 pages that it really wasn't very much to go on. This had been the same general information that he had already gathered himself through some simple digging. Each file basically painted the same picture. Midoriya was a great student, with stellar grades. As far as academics went, the kid was top of his class, shadowed closely by young Bakugo, whom Toshinori suspected only had lower marks due to his stunning lack of respect for authority. It would seem that the teenager only truly stayed on task or kept out of trouble when he'd had something to gain from it. Both students were near equals in all but personality. As suspected, Midoriya tended to shy away from others. He'd had a habit of rambling or muttering to himself while immersed in his studies, but other than the occasional fist fight with other boys, he was a and near-flawless student. With little left to go on as far as a paper trail went, Toshinori decided that legwork would be more beneficial at this point. He was no stranger to questioning a witness. He'd been on many a case and had seen Naomasa operate in person many times before. It was with this mindset that Toshinori found himself walking into the office of Aldra Junior High. He was greeted by a cheery brunette receptionist who was glad to have directed him to the principal's office. After being led inside and made to sit down, he was soon greeted by a portly, older, balding man. Good afternoon, my name is Yagi Toshinori. The pro-hero holds his hand out respectfully. The older man eyes him suspiciously before shaking his hand in kind. I am Principal Ichikawa Hayoru. To what do I owe the pleasure, Mr. Yagi? I'm a faculty member at UA High School, Toshinori explains. I had a few questions for you regarding 2 students who attend here. UA? The man responds in surprise. Yes, sir, Toshinori confirms. Isn't it a little early for UA to be scouting for potential candidates? Ordinarily, I would say so, but this is a special case, the pro-hero explains. In light of the recent tragedy that took place here, UA would like to show their support to the 2 students involved. Immediately, Toshinori could tell that the principal wouldn't be so forthcoming. The older man seemed to have visibly clammed up. I'm not sure who sent you, or what business UA could possibly have by showing up here, but I can assure you, Mr. Yagi, that myself and the superintendent of this school district have taken steps to ensure that an unfortunate accident, such as the one that took place here 2 weeks prior, does not happen again, the man responds tersely. Our legal team and dash. Toshinori raises his hands in a disarming manner. Mr. Ichikawa, if you would please, Toshinori interjects. I am here on behalf of All Might, the balding man tenses, who, I am sure you have heard, is going to be teaching at UA in the coming school year. I mean no disrespect and am not here to speak about the legalities behind this school's ongoing investigation. I am merely here as a mediator, to gather whatever information you have on Midoriya Izuku and Bakugo Katsuki, respectively. Despite Toshinori's attempt to mollify the older man, he still seemed less than pleased to be questioned. What all would you like to know? He eventually concedes, probably just to get Toshinori out of what little was left of his hair, more than likely. We would like it if I were able to speak to the boys' respective teachers, counselors, or anyone else who might know the boys personally, to gather information on their progress. Am I correct in saying that both boys anticipated enrolling into UA as applicants for the hero course? As far as I know, both were aspiring applicants, although I'm sure, you being from UA and all, you're fully aware that Midoriya Izuku is currently out of commission. Not to mention, the boy was legally quirkless. If applying for the hero course weren't so obviously moot now, it would have been nigh impossible for him to have gotten accepted, even if the boy didn't have 1 foot in the grave. In an instant, an anger that could only ever be inspired by a certain someone sparks to life within him. Toshinori's eyes narrow as his fists clenched. He had a pretty low opinion of Baldy, to start with, but what little respect Toshinori had for the man in a professional sense was essentially quashed. As for Bakugo Katsuki, that menace was suspended earlier this afternoon due to yet another incident, in which he used his quirk illegally on school grounds. If not for the legal bind the school is already in, or his questionable mental state, we'd have had grounds for his expulsion. Toshinori was honestly sick to his stomach. All this man cared about was saving his own butt. It didn't seem like he cared at all for the well-being of his students. All he cared about was making himself and the school look good in the eyes of the law, but clearly, ethics were lacking here. As soon as his business was done here, he would be reporting this to Naomasa straight away. Mr. Ichikawa, all due respect, Toshinori intones condescendingly, I will have you refrain from speaking out against children in such a, frankly, deplorable manner. If you are so concerned with the legal standing of this school, I highly suggest starting first with your staff. As far as our reasons for scouting these students go, it is of no business of Aldra Junior Highs, whether a quirkless child should be accepted into a hero course or not. As far as we are concerned, both boys are quick studies, have perfect GPAs, and we as a school feel that they would be great assets. The older man gapes like a fish being pulled by a lure, opening his mouth as if to respond, before promptly shutting it. He looked utterly mortified. Now, if you don't mind. Toshinori adds curtly, may I have the names of those teachers? Toshinori stretches his arms high above his head before wincing, promptly rubbing his aching abdomen. After a day as stressful as today had been, he wished he had more of a liver to have a drink with. Unfortunately, he didn't and simply settled for a mug of herbal tea, courtesy of Chio. Speaking of, he had to speak with her. Pulling off his blazer, he sets it on the back of his rolling chair. Exiting his office, he makes his way to the infirmary. Seeing as it was only 3:30 now, she should still be inside. Giving the sliding door a soft knock, he hears her beckon him inside. Opening and closing the door, he steps into the middle of the room, where he spots the older woman stocking her cabinets with fresh supplies. "Tashinori, what a surprise," she greets him jovially. "Good afternoon, Chio, how are you?" Same ol', as always. I'm surprised to see you here and not lurking around Mizurufu Regional like some kind of ghost," she teases him knowingly. His hollow cheeks flush despite himself as he fidgets under her scrutiny. "Can't get anything past you, now can I?" "Never could," she teases. Chio had been teaching, treating students, and working at UA in general since before even he was an alumnus here. Of course, they were both a lot younger then. Even at her current ripe old age, she was a staple in this institution that they could hardly live without. "What seems to be troubling you, my boy?" Chio asks curiously. Tashinori has the decency to look abashed before answering. "Midoriya Izuku, you were the one who treated him, correct?" A twinkle appears within her eye. "Indeed I did. I still am, technically speaking. I make routine visits to assess his condition. In fact, I did just that today." Tashinori nods. With all he wanted to say, he couldn't find the right words to say them. Thankfully he didn't have to. "Old Torino spoke to me about something very curious recently. You wouldn't happen to know about that, would you, dear?" "Yes, that I do," he mumbles his reply. "So, what really brings you here is a guilty conscience then?" She wagers, skeptically, eyeing him from her perch on a step-stool. Righteous indignation floods his veins yet again, but this time it's well-meaning. "No, not a guilty conscience. It's simple really. I'm doing what is right. And for that, I need a favor." The gaze they share is charged as Chio cracks a smirk. "Whatever you need," she replies. It was nearing 4:30 p.m. by the time Tashinori walked through the hospital's double doors. Giving a nod to the receptionist, she waves him on. He'd been here enough for them to know him by sight and vice versa. He makes his way to room 403 and peers inside to find that Midoriya was alone. The boy's slight form still pained him. He was a hodgepodge of wires and tubes, of which kept him hydrated, fed, and helped him to breathe as he couldn't on his own yet. Thankfully, however, the scrapes and bruises that littered his body were less visible, which made sense. Chio had mentioned she'd stopped by today for an assessment. Physically, the boy was well on his way to recovery. Slowly but surely. But until he was no longer intubated or dependent on N4, they couldn't do very many scans. Until his body healed a bit more, no one would know the extent of the trauma he had to his brain. Taking the seat to the left of him, just near the door, Tashinori stared at him quietly. His viridian hair was a mess of curls and his cheeks were smothered in freckles. He was a pretty adorable kid, he had to admit. Not for the first time since he'd been coming here, had Tashinori wished he could have gotten to know him as he was. He could only infer, or gather what little tidbits he could about him from those around who cared to know him. Those who did, only had high praise for him. Tashinori wished more than anything that he had a time machine, to go back and prevent this mess from happening, but would it even solve anything? Probably not. Izuku would still be the boy with too big a heart, too big of dreams, and too little encouragement. But that wouldn't be the case for long. He had set off on this wild goose chase for one reason alone, and that was to do right by him, and do right by him he would. Down the hall, he could hear footsteps approaching and vicariously familiar voices as they came closer. It was time to face the music. Time to finally meet young Midoriya's precious people, properly. As Midoriya Inko and Bakugo Katsuki come to the door, he swallows hard against the tension running through his bones. It felt akin to his first patrol as a pro hero. He was all nerves and no guile. Steeling himself, he did what he always did in the face of fear. He put on a smile. After such a harrowing conversation, the last thing Katsuki expected to see was this douchebag again. Surprise settles in over both him and Auntie Inko, so he takes the courtesy of breaking it. "Hey, Skeletor," he barks. "Who the F are you?" Life is a funny thing at times. It is literally a conglomeration of tiny pieces. Little instances that are simply fleeting moments that make up a million. It may not seem like much to most in the moment, but that is the catch. Life boils down to those instances. Those mere moments that you didn't think would matter or have much meaning ultimately become a deciding factor in the wheel of choice. This is how opportunities arise. But it is also a reminder of how quickly everything can change. The atmosphere of the room is so thick with tension that it could easily be cut with a knife. Midoriya Inko seemed to be caught between a reprimand and a question, while Bakugo Katsuki was, as expected, at the ready, guns blazing, no questions necessary. Toshinori scratches the back of his neck and laughs awkwardly. Well, that was unnecessary, but all things considered, I guess I could see how one could make the connection. I am rather bony. Ms. Midoriya seems to come back to herself at that moment because she promptly snatches Bakugo, who bristles like a cat thrown in the bathtub, up by his ear. Oh my goodness! Sir, I am so sorry, please excuse his mouth, his manners are really lacking. There's something of work in progress, please, ignore him. With a growl he tugs himself away, offering a muttered apology. Whether for her or him remained to be seen. Bakugo folds his arms over his chest indignantly, silently stewing at the woman's side. His leer never leaves Toshinori's slight form once. It made him feel like prey that was just slightly out of reach of a caged predator. No need for apologies, Toshinori insists, gesturing with his hands. I realize this must look pretty weird. Some guy you don't know turning up at your son's bedside and all, but rest assured, I mean no harm. He offers the woman a spindly hand for her to shake, watching carefully as Bakugo's gaze narrows even further. The woman responds in kind, shaking his hand with some hesitance. Not at all, she replies. Forgive my rudeness, Ms. Midoriya, but my name is Yagi Toshinori, and I am here today to speak with both you and young Bakugo here. He gestures to the boy, if you'll allow it. As soon as Toshinori steps away from young Midoriya's bedside, allowing Ms. Midoriya to take his place, Bakugo's hackles seem to smooth out. Of course, the woman replies kindly. May I ask what this is regarding? Once the three of them are settled and seated, Toshinori takes the floor. Yes, I am a faculty member from UA High School, he begins, noting the exact moment Bakugo's eyes widen in surprise. He watches as the kid's original tension drains out of him, only to be replaced by a tension of another kind. UA? Ms. Midoriya replies, confusion clear in her tone. Yes, ma'am, I am here on behalf of All Might and Principal Nizu, upon Recovery Girl's recommendation. If young Bakugo weren't sheet white before, he was now. Toshinori found this rather amusing. He had heard all about the chip on the boy's shoulder. Wow, Ms. Midoriya's voice wavers. That is quite the lineup. All Might, are you freaking serious? The boy's eyes all but bug out of their sockets. Ms. Midoriya frowns at the boys, almost expletive, but otherwise doesn't comment. Toshinori laughs jovially, scratching his cheek abashedly. Serious as a heart attack, he replies with measured humor before sobering up. In light of the recent tragedy that took place at the boys' current school, UA felt it was necessary to reach out. I see, the viridian-haired woman replies, her brows furrowed in question. Not to sound rude or ungrateful, but why would you feel the need to reach out? Toshinori nods in understanding and goes on to explain. As one of the leading high schools in eastern Japan, we at UA felt we had a responsibility as educators to ensure that we raise suicide awareness in the community. To find out that a tragedy such as the one that involved these boys occurred on a school's property, regardless of business hours, made us realize that overall, a lot of times safety doesn't just include what we can see at face value. Safety also includes the ability to provide aid in areas such as counseling. Midoriya Inko seems physically stunned. She probably never expected a response quite like this. It made Toshinori's heart ache. And not just your typical counseling either, he continues. Schools, while they do offer grief counseling in certain situations, often don't address subjects such as what happened with young Midoriya openly. All of us at UA are prepared to challenge that, Toshinori adds, his confidence unwavering. Ms. Midoriya looks absolutely thrown. Her expression was a mixture of unnamed emotions. What kinds of things will be addressed exactly? Things like depression, bullying, harassment, and physical or sexual abuse. These are often not talked about in school systems, under the opinion that the subject is considered too sensitive to speak about openly. Yet, these are, unfortunately, some of the obstacles that our students often face today, whether it be at home or on campus. More often than not, schools will shirk off such things, he admits solemnly. This is generally the case in hearsay incidents. As a school that breeds the fine young heroes of today's modern age, we want to change that outdated system. Just as we offer SEC education, we will be starting a new system in the coming school year, where we will offer a mandatory class highlighting the importance of mental health, the discouragement of bullying in the school environment, as well as shedding light on matters of importance that aren't often talked about, he relays. Toshinori chances a glance at young Bakugo, noting that his expression is carefully schooled. We feel that treating these matters as some kind of taboo only teaches students avoidance and lowers the likelihood that they will seek help. A lot of times, the kids don't know that they can ask their own teachers or student counselors about touchy subjects, and while some do reach out, they are given pamphlets as a solution. In our opinion, this is a band-aid. Handing a pamphlet out to a student and calling it a day doesn't solve the problem. We at UA feel that if a student is experiencing any type of abuse, they should be able to speak about the matter in confidence, knowing that action will be taken in their defense. We want our student body to feel at ease, knowing that they can ask for and receive help. Wow, the woman breathes shakily, that is a lot to take in. I know, he admits with an awkward laugh, it was a lot to take in all in one sitting, I admit. I just feel particularly strongly on the subject matter. I tend to rant and rave with much gusto sometimes. After a bout of silence, young Bakugo takes it upon himself to speak up. This is all well and good for you and whatnot, kudos to you, but how the hell is this supposed to affect everywhere else? And more importantly, what the F does this have to do with me or Izuku? We're not some furry fucking mascots to be made examples of. Toshinori fixes his electric blue gaze on the boy before him, nodding once in acknowledgement. I am aware of the horrors you boys have been through as of recent. Make no mistake, young Bakugo, I do not intend to make light of what has happened, he assures him. I merely want to make sure that this type of situation can be avoided in the future, if by any means. Which is why UA is partnering up with Shiketsu High School as well. With them in the West and us in the East, as the nation's top hero academies, we plan to lead by example. We have hopes that in doing this, other schools around the country will follow suit, and in turn allow this example to shine as far-reaching as overseas. Bakugo seems to consider this, furtively glancing at Ms. Midoriya before eyeing Toshinori again. As for how this pertains to you and young Midoriya directly, the answer is simple. We would like to have you both attend What? Both Bakugo and Ms. Midoriya respond in unison, both wearing twin expressions of incredulity. Toshinori smiles. Young Bakugo, you of all people shouldn't be so surprised, he teases. The both of you have excellent marks, grades that any junior high school would brag about. I have personally pored through several essays and test results from you both. I have also taken the liberty of interviewing several teachers, as well as the school's librarian. They all had wonderful things to say about each of you academically. Mind you, he adds pointedly, they did also make mention of how often the both of you would fight like cats and dogs, heavily pointing out the clear lack of camaraderie or teamwork both of you display toward each other. Ms. Midoriya spares Bakugo a knowing glance, to which the boy sinks in on himself. But, to say the least, I was impressed by everything I found. I also took note that both of you boys had previously applied for UA recently as well. This only seemed to solidify my decision to offer you both a scholarship to attend UA in the coming school year. I don't know what to say. Bakugo admits quietly, staring holes into his. His entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the boy who was ready to fight him tooth and nail. All that remained before Toshinori now was a shell. It was disheartening to see. Inko places a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder, eyeing Toshinori before voicing her concerns. I can't speak for Katsuki, but I can for Izuku, her gaze hardens. You have come all this way, expended all this effort, into furthering your cause and into investigating his academic history, so surely you must know. So before I agree to anything, I need you to tell it to me straight, because I will not have my boy's heart being broken by this. As Toshinori squares his shoulders, his expression sobers yet again. We are aware that young Midoriya is quirkless, yes. Does that change our decision? No, it does not. Midoriya Inko releases a shuddering breath, her grip on young Bakugo falling lax. The boy, in turn, remains a comforting presence at her side. So, he'll be accepted into the hero course? Bakugo asks skeptically, his gaze yet again challenging. Toshinori sighs, wringing his hands in his lap. No, he starts, watching as Bakugo clenches his fists. Toshinori raises a hand in a placating manner, not at first. You must understand that we are basing this all on what is likely to happen should young Midoriya not have any difficulties recovering. As of this coming year, we are not just accepting students into our hero or support courses, but we are also offering a multi-course general studies program. A lot of changes are coming about for UA this year. A lot of which we are hoping will be positive steps in the right direction. We are adding a handful of new teachers, including All Might to our faculty, as some of our senior staff have retired. Should, God willing, young Midoriya make a complete recovery, he will have the choice to be enrolled into either our general studies or support programs. Ms. Midoriya and Bakugo both seem to be mulling this over. Under no false pretenses are we going to assume he'll be at 100% from the start. We want to give him his best shot at achieving his dreams, yes. But he needs time to recuperate in ways that would essentially hold him back in the hero course. So our main objective will be rehabilitation, as requested and heavily advised by Recovery Girl herself. Ms. Midoriya and Bakugo seem to understand, if their twin nods were any indication. Also, Toshinori adds, we cannot ignore what a talented mind the boy has. I have read his essays on quirk theory and I was beside myself at how in-depth and astute that his findings were. His eye for quirk analysis is, he cups his chin in his hand as if searching for the right words, I'd go as far as saying, unparalleled. Bakugo blinks at that, watching Ms. Midoriya closely for her reaction. For someone his age to be able to gauge how a quirk would manifest or be used in battle, as well as thinking of ways to use them 5 steps ahead, is genius. Ms. Midoriya, your boy's beyond clever and you should be very proud. He would be a brilliant tactician. I would almost go as far as saying his gift for analysis is a quirk in and of itself, but that goes without saying, I am no quirk doctor. Midoriya Inko shifts in her seat, leaning down she digs into a relatively large bag that was set next to the young man's bedside. Reaching into it, she pulls out what looks like a handful of composition notebooks, each one numbered. One after the other, until there were 13 in total. The 13th being the one to stand out the most. As Toshinori eyes the other teenager, he concludes that he was likely the reason as to why the book was so singed. The look on Bakugo Katsuki's face was indecipherable. Young Midoriya's mother pats the books, before lightly running her hand across the top of them gently. She clears her throat, her eyes suddenly very glassy. These are Izuku's notes, she says after a while. Looking up, her verdant gaze locks with ocean blue. It's as you said, she continues, her voice soft as she went. My son may not have a quirk, but he is something special. For years, Mr. Yagi, my Izuku has poured himself into learning all there is to know about quirks. About heroes in general. His favorite pastime was watching an old fuzzy video of All Might rescuing civilians from a train wreck. And he would always say, I want to be just like him, Mom. All he wanted to do was help people. To be able to save people with a smile on his face and make them feel safe. Toshinori's chest clenches and he has to physically stop himself from clutching his abdomen reflexively. Her gaze seemed so far away, her smile forlorn, caught deep in her recollection. When he found out he was quirkless, he was crushed. I never understood when it happened, I think it may have been then, but I feel like I discouraged him somehow. I think that in that moment, I had misread what he was wanting me to say. And it was after this that he stopped sharing his passion for quirks with me, yes. It had to have been then, she trails off in thought. She peers up at him, her expression shifting to one of resolve. I made the mistake of discouraging Izuku when he was young. But I refuse to do that now. Mr. Yagi, I've read these countless times since Izuku has been in this hospital bed, and I just know in my heart of hearts that he has more to offer. He's a kind and driven young man who only ever wanted to help those in need. If you think that Yue would accept him, despite him not having a quirk, I am begging you to please do it. He will wake up soon, and I just know that the state he'll be in will be a fragile one, but if I could provide to him this one sliver of hope that his dreams could be attained, I just know he'll bounce back. May I? Toshinori asks, his throat suddenly dry, holding his hand out for the book sitting right on top. Ms. Midoriya nods, before handing it over. It was the same one from that day. Leafing through the pages, he lands on one page in particular, the page he himself had signed. Peering down at his own handwriting, his resolve is set in stone. Looking up from his script, his eyes catch a pair of calculating crimson. Snapping the book shut, he glances at Midoriya Inko again. It won't be easy, but I believe he can do it. Then you have my permission. That evening, Auntie Inko decided that making a quick trip back home for more clothes and a shower would be beneficial. Leaving Katsuki to keep vigil, he made no arguments, but he did have one request. Hey, Auntie? He asks the woman just as she was about to leave. Yes, Katsuki? She replies curiously. Can I take a look at Deku's notes? He could tell that Inko was pretty perplexed just by looking at her. Have you not seen them before? She asks. No, Katsuki admits. Like you, I've always seen him jotting things down here and there, or doodling, but I never paid any mind to it. I just figured he was being a fanboy. I never knew it was some Einstein-level prodigy sheet, though. So now I'm curious. Inko almost huffs a laugh, pinching the bridge of her nose in exasperation. Sure, I don't see why not. Who knows, maybe this will give you a better understanding of Izuku in the long run. She lays her cloth bag down on the table beside him, removing a small handbag, which no doubt housed her wallet and keys. Katsuki scoffs, throwing her a smirk. The only thing it will help me to understand is probably just how much of a nerd he really is, but whatever works. Be nice, she warns. I will be the nicest. He offers her a faux salute. You better, I have your mother on speed dial, she reminds him. Has she been giving you tips on how to haze children? Because I am feeling mildly attacked right now, he feigns offense. Inko gives him another long-suffering sigh, before pausing. She turns toward him, giving him a deceptively sweet smile. This was his only warning. The hairs on his arms don't even have time to stand on end before he is but over end on the white tile floor and floundering in surprise. It was a wholly unnatural feeling being physically removed from his seat by an unseen force, and for a second she'd completely caught him off guard. It was so rare for her to use her quirk that Katsuki oftentimes forgot she'd even had one. Last he checked, she could only move small objects. The look on his face must have been priceless. Controlling her laughter, Auntie Inko wipes a tear from her eye. She lingers in the doorway just long enough to respond with, "Your mom may have given me a few tips." A few minutes after Inko had left, Katsuki found himself curled up and cross-legged in the chair nearest to Izuku's bedside. While he did have a genuine interest in reading most of these, one thing, in particular, caught his eye in a very familiar composition notebook. Whether under oath or on pain of death, Katsuki would still never admit to how much of a fanboy he himself really was, but that was beside the point. Only someone like him or Deku, who appreciated the finer things in life, would have caught this particular detail. To anyone else, it might not have meant much, but to Katsuki, it stuck out like a sore thumb. Like a vein of gold in a coal mine. It was a needle without the haystack. As he turned to the middle of the unfinished book, bold black ink caught his eye. And it was there, clear as day and telling as it always was in its rarity. The symbol of peace. All Might's signature. Where the F, and when had Deku gotten this? Katsuki, in a word, was a wreck. He was constantly on edge and was always jumping at loud noises. He hardly ate, supplementing food with coffee. His attendance at school was dropping, as were his grades. He wouldn't leave the hospital, and if he did, he wouldn't stay gone for long. Mitsuki was beginning to notice just how thin her son was looking, or how limp his usual ash blonde spikes appeared. But the thing she noticed the most was that Katsuki wasn't sleeping. The poor kid was absolutely racked with nightmares, and from what she and Inko had seen, they were pretty bad. Weeks were beginning to turn into months, and she feared how much worse he would get if any more time went by. But still, despite there not being any real change, her son insisted on being by Izuku's bedside. "Masaru," she pipes up one night. The pair were having a relatively quiet dinner. Such affairs used to be filled with the sound of clinking dishes, bickering, or loving jeers shared by the two resident loudmouths, herself and Katsuki. Tonight was too quiet, and Katsuki's absence was felt like a gaping hole that couldn't be closed. Things just weren't the same without their son around. "Yes, love?" Masaru replies, wiping his mouth with a napkin. Mitsuki, not unlike their son, had a hard time dealing with feelings. Getting her to talk was like parting the sea. It either took one hell of a storm, or it didn't happen at all. So for her to speak up now meant that things must really have been bad. "I miss Katsuki," she admits, her brows pinched. "I miss my baby." Her husband frowns, laying his hand across hers on the tabletop and gripping it for her comfort. She lets out a heavy sigh. It's been so long since he's been home. His grades are shit, his attendance is F-ed, he hardly eats, and he won't FING sleep. "I'm not afraid for him," she gestures with her opposite hand. Masaru nods in understanding. "I know. He needs help," he admits. "The scary part is that he might not be willing to accept it." Mitsuki growls lowly in frustration. "He's wasting away in that hospital, Saad, and I know it's his own sense of guilt that's doing it. Hell, even Inko gets out more, and she's Izuku's mother. I just can't sit back anymore. We gave him space. We let him slide, but if he slides anymore, he's going to end up in a FING ditch, covered in dirt, 6 feet deep." Her husband offers her a sad smile before replying, "He even gave up that scholarship to you," he said. "He'd do it on his own." His words, not mine. "I think it might be time to press the issue about therapy. He has mandatory counseling, according to Detective Tsukachi. Do you know if he's gone recently?" She shakes her head in the negative. "No, the little sheet's been ditching that on top of ditching school." "Can we really blame him though? Would it be insensitive?" "No, the time for sensitivity has passed," Masaru decides. His tone firm. "He needs an intervention, like yesterday. This will only get worse if we let it continue." Mitsuki nods in agreement. "Then I guess we already know what we have to do, huh?" "We do," he confirms, "but I have an idea." For once, Mitsuki doesn't go into the situation with guns blazing. Taking a few tips from her husband, she decided tact would be essential in getting their son help. Her usual methods of shouting or bullying him into doing what she asked, simply put, wouldn't work here. Sure, their dynamic was dysfunctional at best, but she knew Katsuki loved and respected her. She also knew that if she came at this from a different angle, Katsuki would have no choice but to listen. It would hopefully show him how serious this really was. It turned out that Masaru's idea of an intervention was to enlist the help of Detective Tsukachi, who, as it turned out, was a really great guy. He wasn't your typical slap em in cuffs kind of cop. Mitsuki respected that. So when her husband gave the man a call, she had no doubt that this was the best way to go about it. The next day the pair met up with the man, who in turn introduced them to a woman named Inatsu Hana, who Detective Tsukachi assured them was the best therapist in Mizudafu. Together, the four of them take their seats and begin to address the issue at hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Bakugu, it's a pleasure to meet you," Inatsu greets them kindly, offering her hand. "Thank you both for meeting with us today," Masaru replies gratefully, returning the gesture. Of course, it's our pleasure. Now, Tsukachi here informs me that your son is to be attending mandatory counseling." "Yes," Mitsuki admits. "He had one visit with who he was assigned to and walked out. He hasn't been back since." "I see," Inatsu replies, sharing a look with Tsukachi, who offers her a shrug and an awkward smile. "Well, good then," the woman decides. The Bakugus blink in unison, so the therapist goes on to alleviate them. "That just means that he hasn't made progress yet. If he were to walk out on a therapist after having, say, more than 3 or 4 sessions, there would be some cause for concern. In this case, however, it is perfectly okay for your son to have decided that that therapist wasn't for him. I work as both a therapist and therapy coordinator and have been doing this for many years. I am usually the one to go to when you are trying to find the perfect fit, so to speak. Oh, that makes me feel a whole lot better, actually. So, it was okay that he walked out then? Won't get into any trouble? Did I know this was mandatory, so? Mitsuki asks with measured relief. Yes. Tsukachi interjects. We understand that just throwing a kid into therapy doesn't work half of the time. It might take a few times to find someone who is compatible or, rather, someone who Katsuki is comfortable with speaking to. Rest assured, he's not in any danger of getting into trouble. We really only ordered that therapy be mandated because it is clear that the boy needs it. Given his track record both in and out of school and due in part to the incident that happened with Midoriya 2 months ago, we felt that he needed a healthy outlet. I'm sure you agree. Thank goodness, we do, Masaru breathes, replying in relief. Looking in her direction, he addresses Inatsu. It's actually really good that you seem to put so much thought into finding a suitable provider. We agree wholeheartedly, Mr. Bakugo. We want to make sure that our clients are comfortable. We know how hard it is to talk about certain topics, especially with a stranger, so with your permission, I would like to speak with Katsuki myself, if at all possible, Inatsu insists. Yes, both parents reply in unison. Please do, Mitsuki continues. I have been worried sick about him lately. He needs support, and while we've been trying to be as supportive about everything as we can, it's not enough. Inatsu nods in understanding. She could tell it took a lot for the blonde to admit that. I completely understand your concerns, Mrs. Bakugo. I want to assure you that both of you have done a wonderful job so far, truly. I want to put your minds at ease that I will do my very best to find a perfect fit for your son. He might not like it at first, but tough love is essential here. Thank you so much, ma'am. We really appreciate this, and you too, detective. You have been so good to us through all of this. We can't thank you enough, Masaru assures them. Tsukachi smiles at the two of them. Anything to help. Given the situation, the poor kid is going to need as much of it as he can get. Mitsuki frowns despite herself. I am worried. He's been so evasive of everything. He may have a hard time coming around. I'm afraid that he's a bit like me in that regard. He may not listen to reason, she admits. Inatsu eyes both parents, giving them a confident smile. This is completely understandable, Mrs. Bakugo. With your permission, I am prepared to do whatever it takes to ease him into this difficult transition. Masaru and Mitsuki's faces light up in unison, their expressions hopeful. You have our permission. They agree easily. Where usual methods failed them, alternatives were essential. Anything was better than watching their son self-destruct. Inatsu gives the couple an encouraging smile. So, where can I find Katsuki? The sky was a cornflower blue, sparsely dotted with fluffy white clouds that were quickly changing into warm hues. The sun was sinking lower in the sky. The trees sway with the wind as his gaze flits upward. His eyes dance around from bird to bird as they flew past. His backpack was a heavy but familiar weight on his shoulder, which aches from being stiff all day. He takes a few steps forward, watching as the students that remained after school with him trickled out. Some loitered around, locked in conversation at the front gate. He had some time yet before the 5 o'clock train arrived, so he did what he always did and took his time. Pulling his cell phone out from his pocket, he began to scroll through his social media accounts as he loitered in front of the school's entrance. They were bland as always, filled to the brim with feed from all the useless extras that deemed it necessary to add him and clog up his algorithm. At this point he'd heard a gasp from some of the girls standing near the courtyard gate. Fingers started to point in what looked like his direction, only higher. Annoyed and confused, Katsuki steps forward, turns around, and looks up, momentarily blinded by the evening sun's rays. He wasn't quite sure where he was supposed to be looking, but something weird caught his eye. A silhouette. The sun beat down harshly as his eyes struggled to make out who the dumbass that decided to hang out on the roof was. That silhouette seemed to shift. Stepping up onto the low concrete wall, A flash of brilliant green catches the golden light. Shielding his eyes against the brightness, Katsuki's pulse begins to race. There was only silence now. As the wind played with his own coarse hair, it also played with those curly verdant locks. It happened in an instant. "Du." The cry that rips itself from his throat jolts him into consciousness. For several seconds his world spins with confusion. The fogginess from his sleep-rattled state had yet to release him, and his eyes desperately flit around the now familiar room. His other senses start to come back online. A familiar sound rouses him from his panic, as a bead of sweat trickles down his neck. Familiar meant safe. Meant Deku was safe. Katsuki releases a shaky breath, loosening his grip on Izuku's hospital-issued blanket. Its familiar rough texture grounds him as his fingers smooth out the material. That familiar sound was the heart rate monitor, beeping steadily. It served as a further reminder that the boy beside him had a pulse. Slowly, he began to calm down. Lifting a shaky hand, he uses it to wipe the sweat from his brow, dragging it down slowly as he went. He exhales heavily through his nose, staring up at the tiled roof, 56 tiles in total. He'd counted them more times than he cared to admit. Looking around the room, he realized it was just himself and Izuku. He found himself feeling grateful. The last time he'd had a nightmare like this, he'd almost hit Auntie Inko when she tried to wake him. It left him feeling so ashamed that he started to sleep in short spurts, only using power naps to get by. He didn't dream as often. Tiredly, he stares at Izuku's prone form. His color was coming back. His skin no longer held a deathly pallor. Despite this, he was starting to look very thin. The scrapes and bruises have long since faded, and just yesterday, the doctor had removed the tube from his throat. Although he was still placed on oxygen, at least he didn't have to have a DMN machine breathing for him anymore. That was progress, at least. He was starting to look more like himself. Even the bits of hair that had been shaved back during his first surgeries had begun to grow back. At the very least, it was able to hide the obvious scar. Katsuki sighs, sitting up straighter in his seat. On a whim, he reaches out and holds Izuku's slightly cool hand. It had been about 2 months since the younger boy was placed under a medically induced coma, and while Katsuki knew this was necessary, he couldn't wait until they brought him out of it. According to Recovery Girl and Izuku's doctor, his injuries were almost healed enough to do so. This was supposed to be scheduled for the following week. The thought made him both relieved and nervous at the same time. Katsuki was a realist. He knew that the likelihood of Izuku waking up meant it was time to troubleshoot the real concerns. He knew that this would bring on a whole slew of different issues, but even so, just to be able to see him awake, to see his eyes open and know he was there meant everything to him. More than anything, he just wanted the chance to apologize. Sure, he'd said a lot of embarrassing things to him in the last few months, a lot of which Katsuki would take to his grave, but it just wasn't the same. To be able to make amends with the chance of Izuku being coherent enough to understand would be the starting point of another chapter in both of their lives. They could begin to move forward. Katsuki was hard-pressed to do so. Things would be different from now on. He'd make DMN sure of that. And maybe one day, he could even be considered redeemable. As his eyes roved over Izuku's immobile form, he only hoped he would be given the chance. Later that day, a knock on the door jam has Katsuki setting aside one of Izuku's many notebooks. He'd spent the better part of the last couple weeks reading them on and off. He had to admit, they were impressively detailed, and he never knew that the nerd could draw. Looking up, his crimson eyes narrow, locking onto the strange woman at the door. "You lost or something?" Katsuki inquires haughtily. The woman merely smiles in response. "Not at all, in fact, I'm right where I need to be," she eventually replies, her tone self-assured, but also odd. It was as if hearing her speak made him feel weird. "May I come in, Katsuki?" "Sure." Katsuki finds himself replying almost reflexively. "What the hell?" The woman strides into the room gracefully. Her appearance was decidedly professional, seeing as she was wearing a gray pantsuit. She had long brown hair, styled in a side braid, that ran down her shoulder, and had bright, expressive brown eyes. Taking a seat, it was then that Katsuki noticed that she was holding a binder in hand, which she set in her lap. All right then, she says after a moment, her gaze locked on him like sniper peering through a scope. I'm sure you have questions, am I correct in assuming this? Despite himself, he finds that his tongue loosens again, replying with, "You're correct." She smiles again, but this one seemed more genuine, almost apologetic even. Okay, Katsuki, she clears her throat, can I call you that, Katsuki? No, he replies, relieved to find that he could refuse. Okay, Bakugu then? She corrects herself. Yes, he replies evenly. With as many quirks as he's read about here lately, he just knew that he had to be under the influence of one. Very well then, Bakugu, I want you to know that what you are feeling right now is correct, she confirms. This confirmation seems to set him oddly at ease. My name is Inatsuhana, and you are currently under the influence of my quirk, which is called True Intention. True Intention? He asks, finally of his own volition. Yes. True Intention allows me a measure of control over any volatile person in a room at any given time. It works in 3 ways. One is to ensure my own protection, the second is to ensure that the person my quirk is directed at remains calm, and the third way this is used is to measure a person's emotional state. This works mostly by using sound waves. Both received and transmitted, in most cases, simply speaking alone triggers the activation. Why are you telling me this? Katsuki asks after a moment, his expression one of suspicion. Because I would like to establish trust. My quirk can be quite jarring to some at first, but I want to assure you that I don't intend you or Midoriya any harm. Assuming I believe this, why are you here? Katsuki finds himself responding more calmly than he would have normally. I am here to ask you a few questions. Though I admit they will be pretty invasive, but well-intended. To be frank, I was sent here at the request of your parents and I am here to assess your mental state. Oh, for the love of, he huffs, but finds that he can't do much more than that. May I remind you, she responds firmly, but not unkindly, although you may not like this, this is a mandated requirement. By law, you are required to go through anger management and therapy sessions as part of your probation. And to be quite honest, honey, with all the raw emotions leaking out of you, despite the use of my quirk, I honestly think you would benefit from it. Katsuki stews for a moment, considering this. Auntie Inko didn't press charges against him when the suspicion arose during the school's investigation. In reality, with as serious as bullying was these days, had Izuka died, he could have been charged for it. His decision was made. This was the least he could do. It was a slap on the wrist compared to what could have happened. I'm listening, Katsuki decides. The woman in front of him smiles in relief and the tension held around him by her quirk seems to fade by a fraction. I'm glad to hear it. Your parents, as well as Ms. Midoriya and the staff here, some of whom I talked to a little bit ago, all seem to be very worried about you. Would you care to share your thoughts on that? Not really, but I guess. He hesitates, I don't want to worry them. That is understandable. May I ask, what comes to mind when you think of the word therapy? The woman inquires. Katsuki's nose wrinkles despite himself. Someone poking their nose into my business. Yes, that is unfortunate, especially with someone as private as yourself. I completely understand. What if I were to tell you that you had a choice? As in, you have the right to choose the therapist who would be working with you. Would that make you more comfortable? I suppose that couldn't hurt, he reluctantly agrees. Great, because I am here today to tell you that you can do just that. Katsuki considers this, eyeing the woman skeptically. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking that regardless of your choice, you're still going to wind up with someone that will always overanalyze you, or take notes like you're some lab rat in a cage, am I right? How are you doing that? He asks, thoroughly annoyed and a tad bit freaked out. The unfortunate side effect of my quirk is that I am very empathic. I can sense how a person is feeling in such a way that I can almost recreate their thought process. And yes, it is creepy, I know. I can't exactly turn it off. Well, at least you are aware, he snarks. Painfully so, she admits. Katsuki soon found that, in spite of himself, he was actually kind of impressed by her. He didn't know what to make of that. Now, Bakugu, I think we both know that you're essentially stuck now, so why not cut the crap and real talk? Sound fair? Fine, he relents, but I suck at striking a conversation, so I guess you can just ask me questions or whatever. Very well, as stated before, these questions are going to be pretty invasive. If ever you feel uncomfortable, feel free to let me know, she warns him. Sure. Great. Now, your parents have told me that you haven't been eating well, is this correct? Yeah, he shrugs. I haven't had the energy. Inatsu nods. What exactly do you mean by not having the energy? Are you feeling lethargic? Yeah. Okay, I understand. She jots something down on a loose leaf piece of paper. I see that you are curious, so I will let you know, the notes I am writing down are just for my memory alone. I'm not getting any younger, she laughs, tapping her pen to the paper. Sometimes my notes are essentially my brain. You're welcome to read them yourself if it makes you feel better. Nah, for some reason he trusted her word. Now, explain to me how you have been feeling lethargic, she reminds him. He mulls this over before responding. I haven't been sleeping well. I see. Am I correct in assuming you spend most of your time here in this chair? You assume correct, he confirms, tiredly. You're doing great so far, Bakugu. I have just a few more questions. Okay, he shrugs. Am I correct in assuming that you aren't comfortable leaving Midoriya alone, despite the fact that he's under 24-hour care by the hospital staff? He hesitates. Yeah. Why is that? She queries. That I don't like not being able to see him or hear it, he explains vaguely. Hear what exactly? The monitor. He gestures to the machine keeping track of Izuku's pulse. I watched him die, twice on the way here. Each time they brought him back, I couldn't help but constantly watch that green line jump. Each beep that machine makes reminds me he's here. Inatsu's professional smile slips, giving way to a frown. That must have been a heavy weight for you to carry. I can understand why this is so important to you. Glad someone does, he retorts, sighing dejectedly. Maybe he was being unfair? I know why they want me to leave. I get that it isn't healthy to sit here waiting, but I can't stand the thought. Are you afraid that if you leave, he'll die? Katsuki's mouth contorts into a grimace. She pretty much voiced his fears aloud and he knew she knew it. Next question. Okay, she backpedals. So you are feeling lethargic and haven't been sleeping well. Are you having any nightmares? Yeah. How would you rate those on a scale of 1 to 10? Is there a scale for how many times I almost hit Auntie Inko or a nurse whenever they try to wake me? 'Cause that's almost happened a lot. They FNGSCK. Okay, I'd say. That sounds like a 10, she admits with an awkward laugh. More like an 11, but who's keeping track? He shrugs. How about school? Nope, he replies simply. Nope. I don't want to go back there. He emphasizes. Next question? She asks gently. Please, he confirms. What would you say to the idea of taking classes online? I know that Aldra does offer online classes as part of their home study program. Would that be something you are up to? It might require you to do some of your testing in person, but for the most part, you could do your work from the comfort of your home, or here, if there is free Wi-Fi. Is that something you might be interested in? I can do that? He asks curiously, his interest piqued. Of course, all that would be required is that your parents would have to go to your school and enroll you. That I'll do that then, he decides. He couldn't get into UA if he didn't graduate, after all. Great. She nods. I will gather the details for your parents and let them take over. Sound good? Yeah. Good. Now Bakugu, this stays between us. Everything we share here is strictly confidential. In fact, I will have to have you sign a release of information, giving your permission to share information with your school or your parents. That being said, I do, however, within my best judgment, retain the right to inform your parents in the event of an immediate emergency, such as, but not limited to whether you intend to hurt yourself or others. Do bear in mind that you are also still a minor, and while we do maintain confidentiality, we are at liberty to speak with your parents to some extent about your progress. Do you understand? Makes sense, I guess. He agrees. Very well, now as I am required to ask, do you or have you had any thoughts of self-harm? I might have wanted to kick my own butt a time or two, but no. I don't plan on hurting myself or anyone else, he replies honestly. Very good, thank you so much for speaking with me. This information will be vital in finding you a provider that you can connect with comfortably, she relays, gathering her papers into her binder. She looks up and offers him a smile. Katsuki sizes her up for a moment before he decides on something. What about you? He queries. I'm sorry. She responds curiously. You're a therapist, aren't you? What about you? He reiterates. Are you asking me if I would be your therapist? Her tone denotes her incredulity. The last guy didn't even get 5 words in before I walked out. You managed to get a whole DM in conversation, plus you proved your worth, he explains. Inatsu looks at him as if sizing him up now. Am I correct in assuming you're sure about this? You already know I wouldn't have asked otherwise, he responds plainly. Very well then, digging in her binder, she pulls out a card, holding it out to where he can reach it, for 30 every Thursday. If you're going to be late, send me a text. And it goes without saying that if you need anything, also send me a text. He takes her business card and pockets it. I'll be there. During this past week, Katsuki's life had changed tremendously. After Inatsu Hana had taken up the responsibility of being his therapist, she made good on her word and had gotten into contact with his parents, explaining the idea of homeschooling to them. To Katsuki's immense relief, they were very receptive. They went as far as encouraging it, even. That very next day, their decision having been made, they enrolled Katsuki into Aldra's online program and he was all the better for it. Seeing as the entire last 2 months had been highly stressful for him, his new teacher decided to cut him some slack and offer him a few more elective classes to bring his grades back up. While at SCKD that he was swamped with schoolwork, he knew he needed to catch up if he were going to graduate with high enough marks. As far as other academic things went, his application to UA was accepted, pending his entrance exam results. Although Mr. Yagi had insisted he take the scholarship, Katsuki was adamant in his refusal, for a handful of reasons, 2 of which being that A. He didn't feel like he deserved it, and B. He wanted to prove to himself, to his family, and to Deku, that he could get into UA on his own. Pride might have been one of his more Dming qualities, but he was determined to show them that he could become a hero worth his own salt. Mr. Yagi begrudgingly had to admit that he was very impressed by his can-do attitude and wished him the best of luck. To both his and Auntie's surprise and unsurprise, Mr. Yagi had hung around, often peeking in and checking on Izuku from time to time. While this did initially raise questions with Katsuki, he eventually wrote it off as the man just being an overly nice guy. This, however, did not mean that Katsuki wasn't watching his every move like a hawk. Call it a gut instinct, but the teenager was sure that there was more to the guy than what met the eye. Auntie Inko didn't seem to think so when Katsuki voiced his concerns, but even so, the boy found it weird how oddly interested the man was in Deku. But that was his opinion. Over the course of the last week, the doctors had been trickling in and out of Deku's room with higher frequency. Oftentimes they took Deku, bed and all, away for more tests. Katsuki took this as the good sign that they'd been hoping for, because as of 3 days ago, the doctors saw fit to bring Deku out of his medically induced coma. Generally, an induced coma didn't last longer than 2 weeks, 1 month being the maximum limit, but in this particular case, with as bad off as Izuku was, they deemed it necessary to extend it. Now, however, they all agreed that enough time has passed in which they were confident Izuku's head trauma was, for the most part, contained. They no longer feared the inevitability of swelling or further brain bleeds. Now all they needed to know was, to what extent would the damage affect him? No one really knew. As far as they could see, physically, Izuku was almost fully healed. Mostly due in part to the use of Granny Chiyo's, as she insisted he called her, quirk. However, despite this, they wouldn't know much more until they were able to study Izuku's brain activity more thoroughly, and for that, they needed him conscious. 3 days have passed since they removed Izuku from the anesthesia. Now, they were simply playing a waiting game. According to the doctors, it generally took about 3 or 4 days for the propofol to completely leave a person's system. During this time they monitored Deku closely, watching for any sign of an adverse reaction. So far, they were in the clear. Round the clock, Katsuki and Inko slept in shifts, not hardly leaving the room for anything that wasn't of importance. Unless he was under the direct care of his primary physicians, nurses, or Granny Chio, one or both of them were present at all times, keeping a constant vigil. It was around 4 p.m. when it happened. Auntie Inko was curled up on the couch, busying her nervous hands by crocheting a moderately large canary yellow blanket, which honestly looked pretty impressive so far, while Katsuki sat next to Izuku, with his laptop in his lap, studiously working on a school paper. Yawning to himself, he stretches before going limp, his head draped awkwardly across the back of the chair dramatically. Auntie Inko looks up at him, sparing him a short laugh and small smile. "That bad, huh?" she asks. "The worst," he laments, rubbing his tired eyes. "It's one thing to get little sleep without much to do, but another entirely to get little sleep while having a history assignment due. To be young and sleep-deprived. I honestly can't say it gets much better," she teases. "Great pep talk, Auntie, very inspirational," he groans, reluctantly sitting up straighter. "It could be worse, you could be stuck in a dead-end 9 to 5, with bills to pay," she replies with a shrug, adjusting the yarn in her lap. "Speaking of, how are you doing that anyway? You practically live here," he asks curiously. "Perks of being a responsible adult, I suppose. In the last, I'd say, 10 years? I haven't so much as called in once, nor have I ever taken an extended vacation. Add that up with seniority, as well as the fact that I have been working from my laptop and not the office, and there you have it. I have been using my paid sick leave as well as my paid vacation days." Wow, Katsuki blinks. This woman never ceased to amaze him. "What is it that you even do? I see you typing a lot on that weird typewriter, but not much else." "Oh, I'm a stenographer. Normally I do court reporting, but I also freelance in closed captioning. That's actually what I have been doing since I've been here, as it's easier for me to get done remotely," she explains. "Holy shit, are you for real? That's actually really FNG cool. I bet you've worked on a lot of cases involving villains, haven't you?" She laughs good-naturedly. "It's probably not actually as glamorous as it sounds, but yes, I have worked on a few cases that involved crime or villains. Usually, it's typical legal disputes or children's court-related things like that. I basically bounce around to wherever I'm needed." "No wonder Deku is the way he is, his mom's a courtroom badass," he concludes. Just as Auntie Inko works herself up into a fluster, movement catches Katsuki's eye just to his left. His head whips around so quickly it startles the woman. "Katsuki?" she asks worriedly. Setting aside her project, she creeps closer as he waves her over silently, his eyes drilling holes into Izuku's prone form. "I could swear I saw his hand twitch," he relays softly, his whole body tense. Inko gasps, practically crawling into Izuku's bed with him and gripping his left hand gently. "Izuku, baby? Can you hear me?" she asks in such a hopeful way that it makes Katsuki's chest clench. He keeps his own mouth shut, afraid that if he were to speak, it'd break the spell. For all he knew, he could have been utterly wrong. It was unlikely, with how very aware of the younger boy he'd become, but it wasn't impossible. He was only human. He sure hoped he wasn't wrong. Inko frowns after a few moments pass in which nothing else happens. Katsuki finds his own expression shifting to match hers. "Maybe. I imagined it." As soon as the words left his mouth, a groan drew itself from beyond Izuku's lips, causing a spike in his pulse. That was what this was, right? Katsuki could feel it dancing across his bones as both he and Inko share a look. Steadily, Izuku's pulse began to pick up ever so slightly. The constant comforting beep of the heart monitor flickering from its monotony like a fanned flame. His breaths became more shallow and all Inko and Katsuki could do was observe in quiet shock. Auntie Inko smooths her fingers across the back of his held hand, gently, offering as much comfort as she could. "It's okay, baby, it's okay. Take your time," she murmured like a mantra. Katsuki half wondered if she were saying it more to herself than to him. Katsuki could swear that the minutes that passed felt like hours. each one droning on and on like the tired tick of an old timepiece. He couldn't move. Belatedly, he sees Inko reach for Izuku's call-like button, signaling the attention of his attending nurse. When the young woman walks into the room, Katsuki vaguely hears Auntie relay the situation to her. "Yes, of course. I'll go tell the doctor right away," she replies with some excitement. Katsuki guesses that it wasn't just them that were happy with the news. Still, something set the teenager on edge and he couldn't fathom what. Again, it was times like these that he really hated his gut feelings. Reaching out, he takes Izuku's right hand into his own, willing this gnawing feeling of unease away. It was probably just the guilt anyway. As much as he was ready for this day, he knew more likely than not that he would have to face the music. It left him reeling, but nothing could shake him more than what would happen later. 30 minutes had passed since Izuku began to stir and the kid sure as sheet was taking his sweet time. Katsuki began to pace a hole in the tiled floor, while the doctors assessed Izuku's vitals. "Well, it doesn't look like there is anything to report yet," his doctor explains. Simply put, he assures them with a smile, he'll come around any time now. His body has undergone a lot of changes, some more drastic than others, but in the past few days especially. It will take him some time to become fully aware. Right now, small movements and noises, such as groans or no matter how pained, are normal. Rest assured, as far as we can tell, he's doing well so far. "Oh, thank goodness," Auntie breathes. If he doesn't fully wake up by tonight, it's likely that he will sometime tomorrow morning, assuming all continues to go well. In the meantime, just continue doing what you've both been doing. Go about your business, talk, act natural. It's likely that he'll respond to whatever stimulus he's exposed to, so do try and calm your nerves. "Would talking to him help?" the older woman queries. "Sure, you could even read to him. If you wanted, just take it slow. Don't bring up anything that could be potentially triggering. I'd advise you to avoid topics about what day of the week it is, or the month, or year. Just take it slow. We need to know where he's at mentally before we reorient him." "Yes, of course, thank you so much," Inko replies gratefully. An hour passes, in which Katsuki has yet to find an iota of chill. "Katsuki, honey, you're going to wear a hole in the floor," his auntie chides him, her voice tinged with worry. He pauses, huffing a breath. He takes a moment to breathe in through his nose and exhale through his mouth, in deep breaths, just as he was instructed to do by his therapist. "I'm not good at this," he admits. "I usually have two modes, anger or moderate irritation. I'm not good at all of this," he gestures vaguely. "I haven't felt this strongly in a long time. I have emotions that I don't even know the name of, and part of me is just waiting," he explains, trying to keep his voice even and calm. "Waiting for what, dear?" Inko asks, her expression measured. He shrugs dramatically, his arms flopping to his sides as they went. "I don't know, honestly," he replies, shaking his head. Inko sighs to herself, eyeing Izuku's sleeping form. "I think I get it, you're about as harried as I am. Probably more. He gestures to all of her, his mother. Biologically, fundamentally, or whatever, in all the ways that it counts, he's going to take one look at you and just know that things will be all right. I can't say the same for myself." "'Tis Katsuki," Inko interjects, causing him to clamp his mouth shut. "Whatever it is, whatever happens, we'll take it one step at a time. The world wasn't built in a day, honey." It very well wasn't. But he sincerely felt like it was shattered in one. How does one go about repairing something like that? For the duration of the evening, both of them remained on edge. Despite this, they managed to get back to what they were doing that morning, both opting to busy themselves with the mundane. Izuku hadn't so much as twitched in the last couple of hours. With a promise to Auntie Inko that Katsuki would wake her up if Izuku showed any other signs, the woman allowed herself to finally sleep, curled up restlessly on the ensuite sofa. Seeing as the doctor said that Izuku would likely wake up in the morning, she decided that being awake and useful at that time was better than being stressed and drowsy. Katsuki, however, still had a paper due. Since being enrolled in his online classes, he'd developed the habit of reading his work aloud. He didn't know what made him do it, but he liked the idea that Deku might also get something out of it, or at the very least, have some kind of mental STMLTN going on. Tonight found him doing no different. Diligently as he could, he read aloud softly by Izuku's bedside. As he desperately tried not to nod off, he took a swig of his coffee. This sheet's boring and my coffee is cold as hell. An idea seems to come to him. Do you think, if I concentrated hard enough on maintaining the control over my quirk, that I could somehow reheat the coffee through the mug without making it explode? He wonders aloud. I've never tried to not make anything explode before. I bet you'd be all over this sheet if you were awake, Deku. You'd also probably be over the moon if I let you document me testing this stupid theory, he adds with some amusement. Maybe I should suffer through this cold but coffee and wait? How about that, Deku? Maybe I'll save this little experiment just for you. We could test a bunch of different sheet for fun, like we used to. Remember that one time, when we got a hold of a bunch of raw popcorn kernels? Men, that was a fucking sheet show if I ever saw one. There was smoke everywhere, Mom was so said. But it didn't even matter that I got grounded, because what little of the popcorn that wasn't charred actually tasted pretty FNG decent. He smiles softly against the low glow of the dim room. I never said it at the time, and honestly, I'd probably deny it any other time, so you better have your listening ears on, Deku, 'cause I'll only say it this once, but, seeing you giggle, all covered in soot as the fire alarms blared in the background, really made my FING day, he admits quietly. So, hurry and wake the hell up already. I could use your input on my stupid decision-making skills. All was quiet. Until it wasn't. The jarring sound of the monitor increasingly picking up speed catches and grips Katsuki's attention. Ditching his laptop, he grabs Izuku's hand in a firm but warm hold. Reaching out, he presses the button for the call light. Deku. Izu, calm down, it's okay. You're okay, he begins to murmur incoherently, trying to placate the restless boy. As deep panicked Viridian eyes snap open, a gasp rips itself from Katsuki and Izuku both. That dread from earlier instantly pools in Katsuki's stomach as anxious crimson met a frightened verdant gaze. He holds Izuku's hand tighter. Tae-hyun, the bedridden boy manages to choke. Izuku begins to tremble, his entire body shaking like a leaf shuddering in a storm. His eyes begin to lose focus. Katsuki's blood runs cold. Auntie Inko, having tripped over her blanket in her haste, rushes to them. Izuku begins to seize. Katsuki was found pacing, yet again, in the hospital's loading bay by none other than Mr. Yagi. He was a ball of shredded nerves, complete with split knuckles, pacing back and forth like a cornered leopard. His thoughts were a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, swirling around between anger, worry, relief, and confusion. In his momentary lapse, he didn't even realize that the man had approached him until two spindly, but firm hands gripped his shoulders. Drawing his attention, the teen was met with, now familiar, electric blue eyes. Young Baku, Mr. Yagi addresses him, his expression solemn, eyes dancing with concern. He must already know if his pause were any indication. The man's gaze trails down to his roughed-up knuckles, to which Katsuki averts his eyes in shame. What happened? The older man asks him. The wall and I had a disagreement, he rasps lamely. The older man's brow line pinches in concern, a sad smile forming despite himself. Must have been quite the disagreement. Katsuki roughly shrugs out of his hold, but otherwise stays put. Yeah, well, the a-hole deserved it. Mr. Yagi purses his lips, analyzing him before replying with, yes, that may be, but you didn't. An irrational, unholy rage bubbles from his chest and up his throat as a snarl overtakes his expression, his hands popping and sizzling in response. Yes, I think you did. He shoves a hand into the older man's chest out of frustration. To his credit, the slight man remains rooted and firm. I am sick to death of everyone fucking pussyfooting around it. Acting like I'm not some FNG criminal. This was my fault, no one else's, Katsuki insists hysterically. His eyes begin to water, further fueling his frustration. FING. Mine. He all but screeches in protest. Izuku is up there. Right now, suffering. And I can't even do shit about it. I can't even take it all back. I can't help him. I can't fix it. And I've been trying and trying for months, and finally when he wakes up, this sheet happens. Angry tears fall as he paces away from the older man, who thankfully remains stoically silent, but he doesn't stray far, still caught up in his fuming rage as he tugs at his hair. He kicks the curb before decidedly sinking down onto it miserably, gripping his arms and folding around himself. He breathes quietly. After a few moments, Mr. Yagi treads closer, sinks down, and sits beside him. His presence, while initially irritating, was beginning to become something of a balm. The silence stretches on between them, Katsuki staring at bits of loose gravel, deep in thought. "Sorry," he says softly, finally managing to take some calming breaths. "I didn't mean to blow up on you." "I know you didn't," Mr. Yagi assures him. "You're going through a lot right now." "I know it all. Must seem unfair. Ever since I was young, I always wanted to be a hero," Katsuki whispers, his throat suddenly very raw. "But I effed up. I let my ego get to my head. I let that same ego tear us apart. All because I was the best. I had to be, because one day I'd grow up and be strong. Stronger than All Might. Strong enough so that people like Deku wouldn't have to worry about not having a quirk, because I would be there. But somehow," he gestures vaguely with his bloodied hand, "somehow that motivation twisted." Mr. Yagi remains silent as a sentinel at his side, but attentive, so he continues. "What started off as something innocent became so much different. I don't know when my goals became more important than our friendship. I don't know when I even grew to resent him, but I was wrong. Dead wrong. Heroes don't go around bullying their best friend. Heroes don't berate or belittle people. And while I was becoming so self-absorbed, Deku was there, with no power at all, but still somehow managed to be so chivalrous and kind. So painfully helpful and thoughtful of others. He cared more about other people than he did about himself. I thought it set me off, that he had no business trying to be something he wasn't, but I see now that I was only set off at myself for not having those qualities. Set off because I became something else. Deku was already a hero, one who was kind enough to be my punching bag. If I could treat him like dirt, I had no right to call myself one. That's why I turned you down," he admits. "Because I knew that if I were going to become something other than a snot-nosed bully, I had to earn it. I will earn it. And not just so I can be a hero and save lives, not just so I can earn a title or wealth. I'm doing it because I want to be someone worthy enough to be called his friend. I want to be the kind of hero that he'd write about in his notebooks." "Young Bakugu, if I may interject," he clears his throat. "I may not know him personally, but from everything that everyone around him says, the people who know him best all say what a good person young Midoriya is. I think that if you continue to work on yourself, he'll see and respect that. In my opinion, someone like that would never stop seeing you as a friend. Friends make mistakes. Heroes make mistakes." "How could you possibly know that?" Katsuki retorts, hugging himself tighter against the cold. Mr. Yagi sighs. "I would like to share with you something immensely personal." Katsuki perks up at that, eyeing the man with measured suspicion. "Is it about your odd interest in Deku? Because I think I can speak for all of us in saying that it's kind of left field." Mr. Yagi laughs at that. "Okay," he says, "I'll admit, it does seem odd, but I assure you after I explain, it will begin to make sense." "Okay, what is it then?" "Heroes can make mistakes too," Mr. Yagi says again, his eyes downcast. Katsuki frowns, arching a brow. "And that has to do with your obsession with Deku? How?" Mr. Yagi bristles at that, his face beet red. "I do not have an obsession with young Midoriya," he objects. "It's not something else." "By all means, enlighten me," Katsuki deadpants. Mr. Yagi clears his throat before continuing. "As I was saying, heroes aren't infallible. They are just as human and make just as many mistakes. Oftentimes, they can't always save someone that they desperately wish they could have saved, and they carry this with them, like a cross to bear. You are young, but you are certainly no different. You might feel like you've failed, but at the end of the day, you're trying your best to rectify your mistake. To make amends for your shortcomings, that alone is an admirable quality for a budding young hero." I get the feeling that you're skirting around something big, Katsuki replies bluntly. What are you trying to say? Mr. Yagi squares his shoulders. The truth, young Bakugu, is that I met young Midoriya before the incident took place. It's slow, but purposeful, as Katsuki unfolds himself, sitting up ramrod straight. He turns his head slowly, eyeing Yagi Toshinori critically. A certain page in a certain composition notebook briefly comes to mind. He'd never forgot that page. Could never forget it if he tried. All Might was often a topic of interest, shared between himself and Izuku while growing up, even after they drifted apart. If something like meeting All Might had actually occurred, Izuku would be over the moon. Katsuki just knew that despite their current standings, Izuku no doubt would have shared this with him. He'd have shown Katsuki the page in his notebook. Katsuki had no doubt in his mind. But he didn't. Izuku kept it a secret. But All Might was his hero. That nerd would shout it from the rooftops, so why hadn't he? And just what the hell did Mr. Yagi even mean? He'd met him before? Before the incident? There was no way. Izuku was all about getting into UA. This was also another thing that he was likely to share with Katsuki. If a UA faculty member came to him, looking to scout him, he wouldn't have kept quiet about it. Something solid resolves in Katsuki then. The signature in the notebook, Yagi Toshinori's sudden appearance, his interest in Izuku, the fleeting looks he sometimes sees. He'd know those anywhere because they were like his. They were like Auntie Inko's. You said All Might was going to be a teacher this year at UA, right? He asks suddenly, emphasizing the pro-hero's name. I did, the man replies, suddenly sitting up just as straight. See, the thing was, Katsuki was no slouch either when it came to identifying patterns or quirks. And after having read through Izuku's extensive notes, he came to have a better understanding that quirks manifested in a whole slew of different ways. Take the hero Fat Gum for instance, whose quirk was fat absorption. Mind you, not even Katsuki knew this until he'd read Izuku's notes, but a quick Google search confirmed this as fact. Fat Gum had the unique ability to use kinetic energy at the expense of his fat, thus revealing that the man had not one, but two forms. This was also true when it came to a few other pro-heroes. While some couldn't shut their quirks off, some others could. Like Endeavor with his flames, or Mount Lady with her giantification quirk. Knowing this, assuming he was correct, and as Katsuki was beginning to find he often was it possible that All Might could have another form? No one knew anything about the guy. Not where he was from, not where he lived, even his UA files were sealed. Looking at Yagi Toshinori now, the man was pretty unassuming. How could a guy like him, who didn't even look like he could take someone in a fight, be a teacher at a school as prestigious as UA? It wasn't impossible, but teachers on the hero track were pros themselves. When did you meet Deku? Katsuki asks bluntly, his tone no nonsense. Yagi Toshinori takes a breath and finally explains himself. The next morning finds Katsuki very quiet. But what else was there to say after you punched a national icon in the face? To his credit, the man didn't protest one bit. He grumbles to himself. All of this was a FANG mess. Katsuki sighs heavily to himself, glancing over at Izuku. His expression was blank, his eyes closed, moving with slight twitches beneath their lids as he slept. That was new. When he was in a coma, Izuku was essentially motionless. This new state of his, though, as the doctors explained, would have a degree of facial movement. He'd be able to make sounds or respond to certain questions or demands. He'd be able to open his eyes. He'd be able to smile, laugh, cry, maybe even slightly move. But that was about it. They had called it a vegetative or minimally conscious state. The doctors weren't sure which one it was yet. They'd said that it would all depend on Izuku and various tests. They explained that what had happened last night was indeed a seizure. They weren't sure if it made things worse yet, but they knew it had to do with his brain injury. From what they said, it was likely residual stress, pent up, from the moment of impact. The last thing Izuku experienced was his fall. During his coma, his mind didn't have time to compartmentalize or reconcile what had happened to him, so his body reacted in the only way it could. Katsuki never mentioned this, especially not to Auntie Inko, but Izuku was still conscious by the time he reached him. He'd even tried to speak, but couldn't around the fluid in his throat. Katsuki literally watched as Izuku slipped away, and in his panic, he began to perform CPR right up until EMS pulled him away. In the haze of everything that happened, Katsuki had forgotten all about this. And he'd wondered yesterday why the first thing out of Izuku's mouth was his name. Knowing what he knew now, it had made sense. Izuku called out to him, because he was the last face he saw before he lost consciousness. Katsuki didn't want to entertain the thought that this entire time, Izuku had been trapped in a nightmare. It killed him to think about. As he eyed the Viridian-haired boy, his gaze lingers on his eyes, his freckles, his new sparsely dotted scars, the slope of his nose. Katsuki could only hope that that wasn't still the case. No one knew what level of cognizance Izuku would have. But Katsuki knew DMN well, that he was going to do his best to bring him back. If it was the last thing he did, he would do it. Later that week, Granny Chio and All Might, Katsuki applied mentally, walked into the room together, followed by Izuku's primary doctor, his attending nurse, and to Katsuki's surprise, his therapist, Inatsuhana. Auntie Inko, like himself, had been essentially silent all week, only briefly leaving Izuku from time to time at Katsuki's mother's insistence. The woman tenses in her seat at the sight of all those faces. Katsuki's mother, who'd stayed with them all day, takes her hand. Ms. Midoriya, Izuku's doctor starts. We all have a few words we would like to share with you regarding Izuku's future care plan. All right, Auntie Inko replies, after shooting Mitsuki a look. The doctor comes forward, crouching down in front of her. As you know, Izuku is no longer in a coma, and what he is experiencing now is quite different. I'm aware, she replies, worrying her lip. She squeezes Mitsuki's hand a little tighter. After receiving and going over the culmination of test results, all of us here have come to conclude that Izuku is indeed in a minimally conscious state, but we're here to tell you that there is hope. Auntie Inko clutches her chest in response, her lips forming a wobbly smile. Really? Are you saying that my baby will be okay? The doctor shares a look with Granny Chio, who nods in response. We believe that through the continued use of Recovery Girl's quirk, physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy, and other such neuropsychological services, that Izuku has a good chance of coming out of this. However, in order to do this, we will have to relocate him to another facility. One in which he can better receive this kind of care. Another facility? Auntie Inko inquires, staring at her lap. Yes, as you know, hospitals are merely facilitators. We make sure our patients are stable and can function in society, and we send them on their way. An extended stay at a hospital is often unnecessary and costly, but thankfully, outpatient facilities, like the one we are going to suggest to you today, can house Izuku during the duration of his recovery, the doctor explains. Granny Chio comes forward, taking a seat next to Inko on the sofa, addressing her kindly. We actually run a facility that is partnered with UA as a sort of clinic for heroes or heroes in training who sustain injuries during the course of their studies. A lot of these injuries are generally the same as those that Izuku himself has sustained. Inko nods in understanding. We have the means of providing such things as occupational and physical therapies that a hospital like this simply cannot. Our facility also doubles up as a nursing and rehabilitation center, in which it's not uncommon for those recovering from injuries like these to stay for an extended amount of time. We also offer the best mental health services that this side of the country has to offer. She gestures to Inatsu, seeing as heroes are often encouraged to participate in therapy or grief counseling. We highly believe that Izuku would benefit from all of this. Where is this facility? Katsuki's mother asks, stroking Inko's hand with her thumb comfortingly. It's about 5 minutes from UA's campus, Granny Chio replies. And whose care will Izuku be under? His mother adds. Again. My own, Granny Chio confirms, as well as Ms. Inatsu's, whom you are already acquainted. She will be the one who, upon Izuku's recovery, helps facilitate integrating him into psychiatric services. The room is silent, everyone seeming to want to give Inko some time to digest the news. Auntie Inko starts, I'm grateful To all of you really. And I understand that you have worked tirelessly in helping support Izuku, but still, I'm confused. He's not even a student of yours yet. Why go to all this trouble? Her brows creased in concern as she eyes everyone in the room. Katsuki zeroes in on All Might's slight form, standing next to Inatsu. He finds his eyes narrowing, sizing him up as if daring the man to lie. The man in question stares right back, his eyes locked on Katsuki's, unwavering and determined. He takes a step forward, speaking on behalf of Principal Nizu. We make it our mission to grow and cultivate the young minds of today's future, and you and I both know, Ms. Midoriya, that your son is one of those bright, aspiring students. We want to take what happened to him and give it a turn for the better. He's going to need all hands on deck and people who will fight alongside you in his corner, helping to aid him in his recovery. All of us in this room would like to aid the both of you in that fight. If you'll allow us. Inko glances around the room, peering at every hopeful and determined face. Her gaze flits over to Izuku's sleeping form. Her eyes finally come to rest and lock onto Katsuki's. He knows his expression is one of hard resolve. As Katsuki's gaze flits briefly to All Might's, he acknowledges the man in his sincerity. He looks at Inko once more before giving her an encouraging nod. Well then, Auntie Inko hiccups, leaning into Katsuki's mother's shoulder. Tears begin streaming in waves down her cheeks. She laughs a desperately relieved laugh. Let's do this. A chorus of cheers and smiles flood the room. Katsuki was once again stunned by just how many people cared for Izuku's well-being. Each and every nurse, including those he might have initially disliked, each and every doctor, Granny Chio, Ms. Inatsu, and strangely enough, All Might of all people. As Katsuki looked at the relieved faces of his mother and Auntie Inko, he couldn't help but feel that relief spread to him too. Some of them might have made their mistakes. Some more than others, but not an eye was dry in that room today, and Katsuki knew that somehow, things would be okay. Despite it being well into November, Katsuki still finds himself drenched in sweat. The teen wipes some of the sheen from his brow with a gloved hand as he jumps down from the bed of the moving van. For anyone else, this would not be tank top weather, but he ran a little hotter than others. He was greeted by Auntie Inko, who graciously handed him a glass of lemonade, which he accepts gratefully with thank you. It's me who should be thanking you, Katsuki. I really appreciate you helping me. As Katsuki's cheeks begin to heat, he finds a random pebble oddly interesting. He pays attention to it. It's nothing, it's the least I can do. Well, even so, thank you, she insists. She was dressed in clothes that were warmer than his to be sure, but also much the same. Something loose and comfortable enough to move around in. You did most of the lifting with your quirk anyway, he shrugs, sipping his lemonade. Be that as it may, you still lifted a lot of the heavier stuff, which I appreciate, she reminds. I couldn't have done that alone with how out of practice I am. Her smile crinkles her eyes. How much more do we have left? He asks, dodging her praise. She seems to consider this for a moment. Well, we got everything from the kitchen and dining room as well as my bedroom. Did you happen to gather everything out of Izuku's room? Yeah, all of his stuff went in after the larger furniture, the teen reports. Well, I guess other than a few little things here and there, we mostly have everything, she replies, leaning against the ramp of the truck. Katsuki watches as she stares wistfully up at her and Izuku's shared apartment. For as long as Katsuki had known them, they'd lived in this exact same apartment. And from what he knew, Inko had lived here even before she'd had Izuku. So, that was well over 14 years of memories spent in one place. He and Izuku both had shared memories of growing up here. As he analyzes Auntie Inko's face, he notes that this must have been a very hard decision for her to make. Are you sure about this? He asks, not for the first time. Inko nods. Yeah, she replies, turning toward him. Her eyes screamed of determination, but her wobbly smile betrayed her obvious nervousness. Katsuki was struck by how well he knew that look. It was a mirror image of Izuku. It was never more apparent until now that he favored his mother and inherited her strength. Yeah, I want to be as close to Izuku as I can, but I also know that continuing to sleep on a hospital couch is taking a toll on me. This move will do me and hopefully, Izuku, some good in the long run. Plus, he'll be 10 minutes from school once he recovers and I'll be about 5 minutes from the downtown courthouse. It's a win-win really. Katsuki's gaze is far away as he nods a handful of times, digesting her response. He turns to her again. So, a house, huh? Yeah. It's going to be quite different from our tiny apartment. But it's nice. Mr. Yagi went with me and the realtor and helped me with my decision. Seeing as I never owned a home before, he wanted me to be sure which one would suit myself and Izuku's needs the best, without being ripped off. He's such a kind man, she replies with a twinkle in her eye. Kind, too kind, he mutters. Now Katsuki, be nice, she chides him. I honestly don't know why you're so suspicious of him. I have my reasons, he retorts, crossing his arms over his chest. But the first one is that, no one does anything without their own motivations at play. Isn't it weird at all to you that he just shows up out of the blue and tries to stuck us with his stupid motivational speeches and kind words? He begins to trail off, grumbling as Auntie Inko bursts into giggles. Stuck us? She snorts, reduced to a full-bellied laughter. Where do you kids get this stuff? Please, that and stuff, he retorts, his face colored beet red out of frustration and embarrassment. The internet, hell, whatever. Not the point. But still, he does that. That is a thing he does. Maybe you wouldn't know this, Katsuki, but there are people in this world that do nice things for others without getting anything in return. She eyes him pointedly. Look at All Might, he does that all the time. Katsuki bristles at that, throwing his hands up in the air out of frustration, before stalking off toward the apartment building, grumbling as he went. This just seems to make Inko laugh even harder. He throws an All Might doesn't know sheet over his shoulder before he disappears into the building, leaving Inko reduced to giggles and tears. As Mitsuki and Masaru pull up next to the truck in the lot, having returned with lunch, they are instantly confused as to what had Inko in stitches. The greenette simply waves them off, all smiles as she wipes the corners of her eyes. They were almost done here, but there was more yet to do. With everything packed up and the truck's bed having been sealed, the boys climb up into the truck's cab and both of them give the girls a wave before pulling out onto the road. Inko and Mitsuki pile into their respective vehicles and follow the truck out of the lot. After about a 30-minute drive, they all pull up into a shady little neighborhood, the atmosphere of which seemed decidedly warm and cozy. Almost cookie-cutter. The truck then pulls up to a single-story, modern Japanese home that seemed to have a few Western touches. It was a warm cream color, surrounded by a wraparound porch, which already had a few chairs out in front. The area was surrounded by big leafy trees and cherry blossoms. Katsuki vaguely wondered how Auntie Inko could afford it, but quickly nipped that thought in the bud when he remembered what she did for a living and how much she must have saved over the years. This place was nice. Nice. While it did scream Midoriya, in terms of coziness, it also screamed. A national icon helped me pick this out. Katsuki's expression moderately sours at the thought. After a few hours, the moving truck was completely emptied. For as long as the Midoriyas had lived in that tiny apartment near the bay, they didn't have much in terms of volume. They lived simply, having only just what they needed to suit their environment, and it showed. This house was at least 3 times as big as that tiny apartment had been. It was a 3-bedroom, 2.5-bath home, complete with a full-sized kitchen, a dining room, and a generously sized sitting room. Also had a laundry room and several closets for storage space. The entire layout was hardwood flooring, with the exception of the plush beige carpet having been laid out in the sitting room. Both Inko's and Izuku's rooms were massive compared to what they were used to, and both had ensuite bathrooms. Deku, Katsuki decided, was going to flip his sheet. Wow, Katsuki's mother says after a while. Having opted to take a dinner break, all of them were sitting in the dining room at Inko's now hilariously tiny kitchen table. You certainly have a lot to work with here, Coco. Yeah, she replies sheepishly. Scratching the back of her head, her eyes crinkled shut in a smile. When she opens them again, they are decidedly determined. That will just give me more to do. Kind of like a pet project, it will help take my mind off of negative things, that way I can focus on filling this place with love so that by the time Izuku returns, he can have a place to recharge. Someplace new, without any negative connotations. I want him to feel safe and at home. Well, I think it's a great idea, his mother agrees. You need some you time too. You haven't had nearly enough time to process everything or grieve properly. Her gaze shifts to Katsuki at breakneck speed. That goes for you too, brat. PFF me? What for? Katsuki sputters haughtily. While it's fine that both of you spend time with Izuku while he's in the hospital, it's better that you both don't spend every waking moment with him either. I'm sure he'd agree, his father supplies. Both of you need to take a step back and breathe. We know that Izuku is okay now, and he's not going anywhere, so try and relax, his mother continues. Both of you have been on top of the kid since day one, and while that's admirable, it's hardly healthy. You both need new routines. Yeah, if it keeps you from harping on me then fine, Katsuki replies, definitely not pouting. I agree with you, Inko replies in kind. Her gaze flitting between two pairs of crimson eyes and settling on Masaru's warm brown. We won't be able to help Izuku if we let our own health decline. The four of them nod at different intervals. I really appreciate you all, Auntie Inko says suddenly after a moment of silence. Not just with the move, but everything. I couldn't have done any of this alone. Mitsuki smacks her hand on the table with a grin, making the other woman jump. Enough of that now, Coco, we love you. You really think we wouldn't have your back? I know, but still. Thank you so much. Auntie Inko replies with a teary smile. Begrudgingly, Katsuki finds himself dragged into an awkward four-way hug, each of them giving the smaller woman a tight, encouraging squeeze. Katsuki had been afraid before that he wouldn't be considered family to them after everything that's happened. To some degree, that fear still lingered. But as they hugged one another awkwardly around a tiny kitchen table, he was beginning to feel that this wasn't exactly the case. The facility that Izuku was transferred to was actually very nice. It definitely had a much less stuffy vibe about it than the hospital had. It was tailored more toward rehabilitation, and it showed. Each room was laid out differently to suit the needs of its occupants. Those that needed more clinical help than others had more hospital machinery in their rooms, while other rooms merely looked like dorms. There were 2 attending LPNs per floor, 2 nurse aides per hall, and an RN assigned to oversee the unit. With less noise and foot traffic compared to the hospital chaos, all in all, it was a much better environment. Izuku's room, on the other hand, was pretty bland, but that was fixable. At least the view of the outside was nice. It overlooked the garden below. While they did keep Izuku on a feeding tube and catheter, he didn't have much in the way of intravenous machinery in his room. Seeing as he was mostly aware and well enough to breathe on his own now, Granny Chio deemed it unnecessary to keep him on oxygen. She also made mention that she didn't think it'd be long before he was able to chew and swallow his own food with help. Once he was settled into his new environment, Granny Chio said that they should start seeing him appear more animate. Over time, they'd hoped he'd be able to do more than stare blankly or gesture with his fingers. That was still new for Katsuki. In the almost 15 years he had known him, Katsuki had never known Izuku to be quiet. He was a constant ball of energy, nerves, and enthusiasm. He was also constantly muttering to himself, to the point in which it annoyed the shit out of him from time to time. He'd give anything to hear it now. Maybe in time, he would be able to hear it again. After about a week of visiting him multiple times a day, nothing he's done has caught Izuku's attention. Each day was filled with Katsuki either talking at him or reading to him, to which Izuku would merely blink and maybe occasionally sigh, his half-masked expression betraying nothing. It was honestly a tough thing to adjust to. However, rather than get frustrated with it, Katsuki took his therapist's advice and simply rolled with it. This was simply something that every one of them would have to get used to. And while Izuku could and did utter simple words, a new but rare occurrence that left Auntie Inko in tears more often than not, telling him about how Izuku had said, "Mom," on a few occasions, Izuku has yet to speak to him. He tried not to take this personally, telling himself that Izuku would open up in his own time. Today, however, took Katsuki by complete surprise. A few hours earlier, during a session with Inatsu, the blonde had asked her what he could do to get Izuku's attention. Seeing as talking didn't do much, reading didn't do zip, and asking Izuku to perform simple tasks only resulted in dead Viridian eyes staring into his soul, Katsuki was now completely out of ideas and growing frustrated. With himself. "You're being too hasty, Bakugo," she says simply. "Think about this from Izuku's perspective. Seeing as we know that he knows who both you and his mother are, that alone is a good sign. But without being able to tell what it is that he can remember of you, you are probably talking to an Izuku who doesn't know why you are talking to him." Okay, Katsuki hesitates, ruminating over this. The two of you have a history of more than just being friends as kids. The two of you were often very combative. He probably remembers this. Wouldn't you be confused as to why your childhood bully just started showing up and acting friendly toward you? Wouldn't you be suspicious? Granted, this is just speculation. We don't know what Izuku is feeling from day to day, or what he remembers. Until he gets better, we won't have this kind of understanding. So what, should I just give up? Katsuki asks with a frown. Frustration clear in his voice. No, Inatsu intones. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I mean is, start small. You aren't doing anything wrong, Percy. But you aren't speaking his language either. Try to understand him. He doesn't know that you are in therapy. He doesn't know that you have been by his side this entire time. He doesn't know how much you care. Understand my meaning? Katsuki's cheeks heat up at that realization. He does care. He cares a whole effing lot, in fact. It was a weird feeling to acknowledge. So, reading to him, talking to him, that's all still okay? He asks to clarify. Definitely yes, that is perfectly okay. Just keep the topic simple. Diving in too deep is too much for him to process right now. In this case, less is more. She assures him. But Aunt Inko can get him to do so much more than I can, he replies, frowning. Have you tried telling him your intentions? Inatsu asks him, tapping her pen against her blank notepad. Katsuki considers this, rubbing his chin. No. I haven't. I'm not touchy-feely. Never have been. I'm either all in or all out. Well, that there could be why he isn't responsive, she deduces. Izuku knows his mother. They have a bond. And not one that was based on pain. In her case, she has an advantage that you don't. He trusts her intentions. However, if you build upon having a relationship with him in the now, as he is, he may be more receptive. Reflexively, Katsuki bites his bottom lip, that sinking, tingling fear that has been lurking within him revealing itself. Would that ever even be possible? For Izuku to trust his intentions? After everything? Resolve steals within him. For Izuku to ever open up and be receptive to him, they'd have to start over. Completely. A clean and unblemished slate. Inatsu was right. So, I just have to meet him where he's at. Katsuki wonders, his brows furrowed. Exactly. Meet him there, because that's the only place you can. Dredging up old childhood memories is good and all, but they don't serve you. Those memories of you aren't as fresh in his mind as your time spent at war with one another is. Meet him where he is now, show him who you've become, and you'll likely have an easier time of it. Inatsu replies with an encouraging smile. Determination blazes behind his crimson eyes. Okay, so what should I do? He didn't know why he chose this out of every single one of his options, he honestly didn't, but it happened. He may as well commit to it. He'd read somewhere that flowers help the sick recover. And frankly, in his opinion, Izuku's room was bland as F-. He needed the STMLTN, that's all. That's what he told himself when he walked through Izuku's door at 6 p.m. with a vase full of what he thinks are called forget-me-nots. It was stupid and hastily planned. They were hand-picked from an old lady's garden, but at least he'd had a vase lying around the house that no one ever used, so he figured, why the F not? At least it would bring a bit of color into Izuku's room. He steels his nerves right as he walks through the door, watching as Deku ever so slowly looked in his direction. Katsuki knew that his face was aflame, but he powered through it, walking awkwardly through the room and plopping down next to the green-haired boy. The vase slipping slightly in his sweaty, trembling hands. The realization was a slow, but memorable one. Katsuki didn't think he'd forget this moment for as long as he lived. He could pinpoint the exact moment cognizance came into Izuku's eyes because they began to dance and glitter, alight with vibrant life. Katsuki sits up straighter in his chair as Izuku slowly lifts a trembly finger toward himself. The blood drains from Katsuki's cheeks in the realization of what he thought Izuku might be asking him. Weiss, he finds himself stammering out. There for you. This room seriously fangs. So I thought, why the hell not? I know it's stupid. But he begins to ramble. The small smile that slowly blooms on Izuku's face leaves him still in his seat, his breath hitching in his throat as that persistent heat returns to his cheeks. Izuku's lips twitch. He watches his mouth open and close as though trying to find words, but coming up short. After about a minute or two of them sitting in silence, Izuku finally manages the best word Katsuki's ever heard in his life. It's soft. It's quiet. Just barely there. But Izuku murmurs the word, pretty, and Katsuki's world realigns. The next day is yet another shock. Another word comes. As well as a frown. As soon as Katsuki walks through the door, he sees Izuku's dim gaze flit to his, lighting only momentarily as he points at the tabled vase of now wilted flowers. Dead? He murmurs with a frown. And Katsuki could cry. The floodgates open after that. Word after word comes. Slowly, day by day for 7 months. Right up until he graduates middle school. Right up until he passes his entrance exam. And even up to his first day at UA and after. Katsuki makes DMN sure that he brings Izuku flowers. And potted plants. Things that he knew for a fact wouldn't die. He helps him tend to them. Waters them. And each day he fills Izuku's world with color. Over the course of the last 7 months, several milestones were crossed as Izuku began to show promising signs of coming out of his minimally conscious state. It was like a switch had been flipped and one day he seemed much more alert and oriented. It was a relief to everyone involved. Izuku met daily with a speech therapist, who began working with him on his communication skills. Although he could understand verbal language and requests, his ability to form responses was a barrier that was difficult for him to cross. It was like the synapses in his brain couldn't quite formulate what he wanted to convey, which left him frustrated. So, where words failed him verbally, the speech therapist began teaching Izuku and those around him basic JSL. It was a joint effort and a work in progress, as they were essentially learning an entirely new language, but it was much better than no progress at all. Izuku really seemed happy to be getting back into the habit of communicating his needs freely. He began to focus on his JSL lessons so intently, soaking each one up like a sponge, that his level of cognizance and alertness was re-evaluated. Oftentimes, after a day's lesson, he was found in bed, signing simple things to himself, as if trying to pick them apart and truly articulate them. To an outsider, this would look silly, but to everyone who knew him best and knew how he operated, it was a very Izuku thing to do. Katsuki would often tease him good-naturedly, calling this new quirky behavior his new form of mumbling, which Inko had found to be quite amusing. During this time, Izuku was taken off of his feeding tube, now able to eat a puree diet with assistance. And in an effort to reorient his body, he was taken off of his catheter as well. He still needed help to the restroom, but otherwise, he was really coming back into his own. Especially with the help of restorative therapy, who also began working with him on his mobility. During this time, he'd even made a few new friends, which both surprised and came as no surprise at all to Katsuki initially. This new version of Izuku was almost more carefree and unrestrained in ways Katsuki hadn't seen in a very long time. Almost childlike in nature, people started to gravitate to the bedbound boy as if he were sunshine incarnate. One day a few months prior to his graduation, Katsuki had walked into Izuku's room with a flower pot full of budding azaleas, only to find that he was being entertained by an older woman with snow-white hair and soft gray eyes. She was dressed simply and her feet were adorned with slip-resistant socks, so Katsuki instantly knew that this woman wasn't a nurse. Her voice was light and motherly as she read softly to the bedbound boy. Izuku's viridian eyes locked on her with childlike rapt attention. It took a moment for the pair of them to notice Katsuki standing in the doorway, and as soon as they had, He'd felt like a fly on the wall as their gazes found him. Recognition passes through Izuku's expression and he instantly responds with a bright smile. Kacchan! Kacchan! See come? Izuku attempts verbally, beckoning him over with a shaky hand. Katsuki ditches his shoes at the threshold, towing himself into a waiting pair of hospital slippers. He makes his way over to the greenette and the snowy-haired woman, who seems to smile kindly at him. So you're the one who's always leaving Izuku such lovely flowers, she concludes. I hope you don't mind, I took the liberty of watering some of them today. Katsuki took note of two things. One was that she was apparently on a first-name basis with Deku. And two, he'd seemed to be completely at ease with her. This alone spoke volumes because Izuku didn't normally talk for or in front of strangers. It was decided right then that he'd put aside his suspicions and reserve his judgments until after he'd investigated this some more. Caught red-handed, he replies as politely as he can muster, and that's all right. I was beginning to wonder if maybe the nurses started doing it while I wasn't here. I'm assuming it's been you? You assume correct, she smiles warmly. Kacchan, let me see? Izuku reminds him, tugging lightly on the sleeve of Katsuki's hoodie. Katsuki complies and situates himself on the bed next to Deku, taking care not to sit on his atrophied legs. He turns the pot in hand and sits it carefully in Izuku's lap. The woman watches them quietly, seemingly content to observe their interaction. Do you like them? They're called azaleas, he asks the forest-haired boy, hinting to the tiny shrub of pink flowers, trying all the while to will the growing blush from his face. It wasn't often that he was put on display in front of others. Usually, his time with Izuku was private. He starts, testing the word on his tongue. Azalea, he says finally, signing the letters in conjunction with his speech. Katsuki confirms, signing back to him with the correct spelling. Izuku's face lights up again as he responds with Katsuki's favorite word, pretty. Glad you like Deku, so who's your friend? He asks, gesturing casually to the woman with his head. Rei, the younger boy replies brightly, signing her name as he did. Rei and Miss Rei. Oh, and how long have you known Ms. Rei? He asks the woman more so than Izuku. She seems to understand this, so she responds for him. She hesitates at first. I live here too, I've been here for about 10 years. I only met Izuku fairly recently. I like to walk around the facility sometimes and interact with people, as well as read to children. When I met Izuku's mother, she told me about his condition, so I started coming around more and spending time with him, she explains. Katsuki eyes her curiously. She had said 10 years. Why would she have been here for so long? 10 years was a long time to be in a nursing and rehabilitation center. He honestly found that a bit surprising and also kind of sad. About 1,000,000 questions came to mind, but he didn't dare utter a single one. If Rei wanted to talk about it, she wouldn't have hesitated. Katsuki decides to let it go. And let it go he did. The answers would later come to reveal themselves. Todoroki Rei, as he came to find, became something of a staple in their lives. She was a warm and nurturing presence for Izuku. In light of his or Auntie Inko's absence, she often kept him company. Katsuki decided that this was good for him and likely just as good for her, so he let it be. Soon coming into the room and finding them together wasn't so abnormal. The woman was insanely sweet and oftentimes kept Auntie Inko company. The two of them became fast friends and it was clear to see why. They were a lot alike. This probably attributed to why Izuku was so comfortable with her. After a while, Rei had even met his own mother, who'd also instantly took to her, and in return, all of them had met 2 of her 4 children as well. Fuyumi and Natsuo respectively even took their own turns in coming and visiting with Izuku from time to time. Katsuki could honestly say he was content with knowing that Izuku was reaching out more to others, as it would only help his recovery in the long run. As the months went by and after having passed his UA entrance exam with top marks, things seemed to only get better from there. Having someone around to constantly help stimulate his mind helped Izuku reconnect with the world around him. He was much more animated, and despite having an obvious speech impairment that his speech therapist had called anomic aphasia, he slowly began speaking better, Though he still greatly relied on the use of JSL in conjunction with his words, he was well on his way to making a full recovery. According to Granny Chio, all he would need after a while would be physical and psychological therapies. It quickly became apparent to everyone involved in his care that Izuku didn't remember the incident. It was hard to tell at first what he did and didn't remember, because Izuku had known his mother and Katsuki for his entire life. But they made peace with meeting him where he was at currently, regardless. Both of them were just grateful that his long-term memory didn't seem to be greatly impacted. It was also very difficult at first to determine what he did and didn't remember academically due to his limited communication skills, but learning JSL helped with this greatly. With a bit of experimentation using various types of trivia games as a baseline, Katsuki and the speech therapist determined that Izuku remembered most, if not all, of his basic primary and middle school education. He could still read, he knew maths, he remembered basic science and history. Academically speaking, everything he learned was still pretty much intact. His speech and fine motor skills, however, were still very much lacking, which was clearly starting to frustrate the teen. Izuku couldn't hold a pencil to write with. He'd had a hard time holding spoons to eat. Lifting his atrophied arms for long periods was tiring for him, and his atrophied legs were obstacles he still needed to overcome in general. At best, his mobility was limited. But Granny Chio assured them that with a strict regimen of physical and occupational therapies, he'd be doing these things again on his own in no time. The day Katsuki got his acceptance letter to UA, he'd had half a mind to toss the DMN thing out the window. It wasn't that he hated All Might, not at all. He was just disappointed. The man was every bit as great as he'd thought he'd be. And having him as a teacher was like a childhood dream come to life. But when he thought about how one fated conversation may have tipped Izuku over the edge, his image of the man distorted and soured. It was probably unfair of him and probably very hypocritical to be feeling this way, but even so, Katsuki expected better from a man of All Might stature. A snot-nosed brat like him bullying someone is almost expected. But a living legend telling a depressed teenager that he couldn't achieve his dreams and to be realistic about his limitations? That would be disheartening for anyone to hear, especially coming from someone you idolized. And what made matters worse was the fact that only he knew about it. When confronted with Yagi Toshinori for the first time since the incident, Izuku didn't know who the man was. It was almost unfair, somehow. Unfair in the regard that, even if All Might were to apologize to him, Izuku wouldn't have had any idea what it was for. Katsuki could tell that the lack of recognition also didn't sit well with Mr. Yagi. Part of him felt that the man deserved it, but the other more rational part of him, that he was becoming familiar with through his own therapy, felt kind of bad. Only the two of them knew what had actually happened in the days prior to Izuku's suicide attempt. And there was no real way for the man or Izuku to find closure. After that, Yagi Toshinori, much to Katsuki's begrudging respect, still continued to studiously visit him. He explained to Katsuki that even though Izuku didn't remember their encounter, it didn't give him a free pass. He explained that he would do anything and everything in his power to make it up to him. He'd also expressed an interest in getting to know him better, as he hadn't had the chance before. And with as salty as Katsuki's been toward him, he began to find that his respect wasn't quite as begrudging as it had been before. Maybe it was for the better that Izuku didn't remember such a tragic moment in his recent past? Maybe this was the best chance he'd had at leading a decently normal life? Although, sometimes even silver linings had their pitfalls. It had been about a week after his first hellish day of class, when Katsuki stepped off of the elevator, only to be greeted by a CNA who usually worked on Izuku's hall. "I wouldn't walk in there just yet," she warns him. "He's with his mother and he's kind of emotional right now." "You can do what you want," she assures him just as he's about to protest, "but, just fair warning." He acknowledges her warning with a nod and makes his way down the hall. Katsuki finds himself at odds as he quietly approaches the door, standing just outside of the view of the threshold. It's been months since he'd heard the sound of Izuku crying, and for the first time ever, he finds himself hating the sound of it. Soft, shuddering hiccups. Quietly miserable sniffles. He speaks into what might be a tissue. Wimih here? I want. He struggles with the words. Katsuki assumes he starts signing to her instead when he hears Auntie Inko's reply. Oh, baby, she replies, sounding every bit as choked up as Izuku does. I know you want to come home and you will. Soon, I promise. Boo, but Wn? Izuku, blowing his nose into what was now confirmed as a tissue. Iwa dash, he pauses, working out the words. He sounds frustrated with himself. He tries again. School? He says finally, clear as day. That was a new word in his repertoire. Want to go. Kacchan. Katsuki's head thumps softly against the wall outside the door, his shoulders slumping heavily. He should have known this was coming. Izuku was always so positive, so patient with himself and others. He didn't know why he was here, but he knew he was hurt and that he was getting better. He was likely beginning to understand more and more that his predicament was a lot worse than what they had initially been telling him. He was likely beginning to feel trapped here, while Katsuki and his mother, while Natsuo and Fuyumi, and Mr. Yagi, all had lives outside these walls. This realization gutted Katsuki. He decides something then and turns around, walking right back toward the elevator. Granny, Katsuki barks once he'd reached Yue's infirmary. The old woman wasn't due back to the outpatient hospital until later that week, as classes had just started. Why am I not surprised to see you skulking around after hours? She teases him. What can I do for you, Katsuki? When will Deku be able to walk? Your quirk should be able to help him walk, right? Katsuki all but demands. Chio eyes him critically. Taking in his appearance, he was sure she could probably tell he'd run all the way back here. She sighs heavily, leaning back in her seat. Dear, if it were that simple, I'd have had him up and him already, she admits. She watches as he visibly deflates. Although not one to take defeat so easily, he challenges her again. At the very least, you can help him with his arms, right? What are you getting at, Katsuki? Has something happened? You know more than most that my quirk, although helpful, isn't a cure-all, she replies ruefully. Katsuki grinds his teeth, glaring holes into the linoleum floor. He was beginning to feel his blood pressure rise with his frustration. He's sad, he says finally. Sad? Chio asks suddenly, sitting up straighter. How so? Not that kind of sad, not like he's going to hurt himself, but he's frustrated. Wouldn't you be? Sitting in a bed all day, hardly able to move because your muscle mass has declined? He wants to do sheet. He wants to go back to school. He wants to have a life like me. Chio frowns. He wants to go home, Katsuki utters quietly, his anger finally draining from him. You know, as well as I do, that most of his recovery is dependent on him, she starts, holding up a hand in silence as soon as Katsuki's head snaps back up with a retort at the ready. We can't rush this much more than we are. Healing broken bones and stopping internal bleeding is one thing, dear. Creating muscle mass is an act only a god can attempt, and I am not one. His body was so broken and beaten beyond repair. I know you know this. You were the first of us to see it with your own eyes, she replies sternly. Katsuki purses his lips, his gaze calculatingly cool. As far as injuries go, she continues more gently, he has none that need attending. I'm afraid that if I try to budge him even more, what little stamina he does have will be wiped out, and that'd only hinder his progress. Take one of your little potted plants for instance, she says, gesturing to the small potted succulent still in his hand. He'd completely forgot he'd even had it. If you were to pluck each petal off but one, do you think the others would grow back overnight? No, he begrudgingly admits, his brows furrowing. Well, I'm not saying I won't try to help him, she decides, making Katsuki's gaze snap back up to meet hers. Surprise coloring those crimson spheres. But if this doesn't work, I will not be forcing his body to heal anymore. Got it? Got it, he affirms. As far as academics are concerned, once we can get the range of movement in his arms and hands back to normal, or at least functional, we can set about setting him up with online courses like you had. Really? His eyes widen. Yes, so long as his mother approves this, the old woman confirms. I have no doubt in my mind that she will, That woman is a saint, he replies genuinely. Chio smiles, heaving a long-suffering sigh as she stands up. Well, what are you waiting for? Katsuki grins victoriously as they exit the room. The tiny potted succulent nestled safely in his hands. Just down the corridor, pausing just outside of the study hall, yet another pair of crimson eyes trail after them curiously.